2 in the morning. No moon. No stars. A strange smell crept through the window seam coal oil, soaked deep into a rag wrapped around the head of an unlit torch. In a log cabin at the heart of a Wyoming valley, a woman's eyes snapped open. Not from a sound. From the silence, the wrong kind of silence. The kind where every animal on a working ranch stops breathing at the same moment. The owl in the barn eaves did not call. The horse in the stall did not shift. Out there, 3 shapes were moving low along the tree line, slow and patient, the way of men who had done this work before. Her hands were shaking. She let them shake. Her father had taught her once, fear was not the enemy. Fear that stopped your hands was. She reached for the old rifle above the hearth. A cartridge slid home, a small certain click. Then she opened the door and stepped out into the dark. Elk Creek, Wyoming Territory, 1885. Before the sun even touched the ridge, Josephine Marlow was already lying flat in frost-stiffened grass, breathing slow, watching a mule deer buck pick its way down a game trail. 300 yards below her. 300 yards, in open country. With wind coming sideways off the western bluffs, cold enough to numb a man's fingers before he could find his trigger. She didn't blink. She didn't need to. The rifle across her forearms was older than she was, heavy. Octagonal barrel gone the color of a storm cloud, stock worn smooth in places where 3 sets of hands had gripped it before hers. A Sharps, 50 caliber. The kind of gun men used to call a buffalo gun, back when there were still buffalo enough to need one. Back before the herds thinned to nothing and the Great Plains went quiet in a way that still made old hunters go quiet themselves. Remembering her father had called it the only honest thing he ever owned. Josie called it Ezra, when nobody was listening. After the man who'd carried it before her, she'd been out since well before first light. 2 hours, walking the high ground above the valley in the dark, reading the frost-silvered grass for sign the way her father had taught her a broken stem here, a half-print there, the faint, sweetish smell of deer musk carried down on the wind if you knew to lift your head and search for it instead of watching only the ground. Most men hunted with their eyes. Her father had taught her to hunt with everything else first and let the eyes confirm what the rest of her already knew. It was slow work. It was supposed to be slow. Impatience got a man nothing out here but empty hands and wasted powder, and powder cost money she didn't have to waste. The buck lowered its head to drink from the creek. Wind shifted, steadied. She let out half a breath, held it, because that was the moment her father taught her, mattered more than any other. Not the squeeze, not the aim, the stillness before it, the half-second where the whole world had to agree to hold its breath along with you. There was a particular kind of quiet that settled over a person. In that half-second, Josie had never found the right words for it. Not in 26 years of chasing it. It wasn't peace, exactly. Peace implied the absence of something. This was the opposite. This was every sense she owned, pulled taut at once, singing, alive, until the whole world narrowed down to one small, bright point of certainty. Her father used to say a man only found that stillness a handful of times in his life, if he was lucky. Josie had found it 1,000 times over, alone, in cold grass before dawn, because it was the one thing in her life since Nathaniel died that still made sense to her. The rifle didn't lie, the wind didn't pretend. Out here, in the half-second before a shot, the world was exactly what it was, and nothing more. The shot cracked across the valley like something breaking open. 300 yards away, the buck folded where it stood, clean, quick, no suffering in it, which was the only mercy Josie Marlow still believed the world owed to anything, man or beast alike. She lay there a moment longer, cheek against the stock, listening to the echo roll off the bluffs and die somewhere out past the tree line. A red-tailed hawk lifted off a dead cottonwood a quarter-mile east, startled by the sound, wheeling once against the pale sky before it settled again. Then she stood, brushed the frost off her coat, worked the stiffness out of shoulders that had held one position too long in cold, that didn't care how young or old you were, only how long you asked your body to stay still in it. And she went to do the ugly, necessary work that came after every kill, because a rifle like that didn't care about glory. It only cared about whether you were willing to do what came next. She field-dressed the buck with a knife her father had carried in the war before he ever came west, hands moving through the work with the same economy she brought to everything else in her life. No wasted motion. no flinching from what needed doing. She'd learned young that squeamishness was a luxury for people who had somebody else to do their killing for them, and Josephine Marlow had not had that luxury in a very long time. It was not a life she would have chosen. If choosing had ever truly been offered to her, a young widow doing a hunter's work alone before dawn, doing a rancher's work alone the rest of the day, falling into bed each night too tired, most evenings even to properly grieve. But it was, she had come to understand over 2 hard years, an honest life, and there was a kind of dignity in that honesty she had learned to hold on to on the mornings when self-pity threatened to get the better of her. The meat she brought home fed her. The hides she sold, along with what the small herd of cattle she still kept, could bring at market, paid what taxes and needs a homestead this size required. It was not much of a living, measured against the fortunes men like Silas Kane had built for themselves in this same territory, but it was hers, earned by her own 2 hands, and she had found, somewhat to her own surprise, in the aftermath of losing everyone who might once have shared the load, that there was a fierce, quiet pride in that fact which grief had never quite managed to smother. She thought sometimes, on these long rides back toward town, with the morning's kill lashed behind her saddle, of the particular arithmetic her life had become. A good doe brought perhaps $4 in meat and hide combined, more for a buck this size, with its heavier hide and better cuts. A season's trapping, when she had time enough to run a proper line, might add another $20 or $30 beyond that, if fur prices held steady, which they rarely did anymore, not since the eastern markets had grown so particular about quality and so stingy about price. Against that, she weighed taxes on the land, twice yearly, and the cost of what she could not grow or shoot or trade for herself. Coffee, sugar, cloth for mending, the occasional new tool when an old one finally gave out past repair. It was a narrow arithmetic, drawn tight, with little room in it for a bad season or an unlucky winter. She had managed it 2 years running now, alone, through sheer stubborn attention to every column of the ledger, and she intended to go on managing it, whatever Silas Kane believed her capable of enduring. By the time she had the meat wrapped and lashed behind her saddle, the eastern sky had gone the color of a healing bruised deep purple, fading up through rose into a thin, hard blue. Another day, another chore, another quiet mile between herself and the life she used to think she'd have. She rode back toward Elk Creek slow, giving the horse its head along the familiar trail, and let her mind do what it always did on the ride. Home wander, unsupervised, into places she didn't much like to visit, but couldn't seem to keep herself from. She thought about the meat she'd sell today, and what it would bring, and whether it would be enough alongside the hides to see her through another stretch. She thought about the fence line on the north pasture that needed mending before the first hard freeze. She thought, as she always eventually thought, no matter how hard she tried to steer around it, about the 2 men whose absence had shaped every single one of these small, grinding calculations. Her father, whose voice she still heard clearer than her own some mornings, and her husband, whose silence, 2 years on, still had a particular weight to it that never seemed to lighten no matter how much time passed. She was 26 years old, small enough that men still underestimated her on sight, 5'3" in boots, dark hair pinned back plain and practical, a face that might have been called beautiful in a life where she'd had time to notice, or cared to. She wasn't unaware of it. She simply didn't have use for it anymore. Beauty didn't put meat on the table. Beauty didn't keep the roof from leaking. Beauty, in her experience, mostly just made men slower to believe what she was capable of, which, she'd found, over time, had its uses. Let them underestimate her. It had never once cost her anything she wasn't willing to spend, and it had bought her, more than once, the half-second of surprise that made all the difference. By the time she rode into Elk Creek proper, the town was stirring, the blacksmith's forge already glowing at the far end of the street, the dry goods store unlocking its shutters, a couple of ranch hands loading a wagon outside the feed store with the particular unhurried grumbling of men who'd rather still be in bed. And the town, as it always did, was already talking about her. Elk Creek wasn't much of a town by the standards of places further east. One main street, packed dirt gone to mud whenever it rained hard enough, lined with a general store, a saloon, a small church with a steeple that leaned a few degrees off true, a blacksmith's shop, a land office that mostly sat empty these days, and the sheriff's office with its single cell that had held, in Josie's memory, exactly 2 prisoners in as many years, both of them drunk cowhands sleeping off a Saturday night. It was the kind of town where everybody knew everybody's business, whether that business wanted knowing or not. "There goes the widow Marlow," said Mrs. Abernathy outside the dry goods store, not quite lowering her voice enough as Josie rode past. "Out hunting again. Alone. Lord, it isn't decent. Somebody's got to feed her," said the woman beside her. Josie recognized her as Mrs. Pruitt, wife to Otis the blacksmith, though she'd always struck Josie as considerably less kind than her husband. Can't say her husband left her much else. Josie kept her eyes forward, kept her spine straight in the saddle. She'd learned 2 years ago that the fastest way to survive a town's pity was to never once let it see you flinch. Because if they saw you flinch, they started asking why. And there were things in Elk Creek that were safer left unasked. It wasn't that the town was cruel, exactly. Josie had turned that thought over enough times to know it wasn't quite fair. Most of them meant no real harm. Most of them, if she'd collapsed on the street tomorrow, would have carried her home and nursed her fever, and brought casseroles for a week. It was simply that a woman alone, doing a man's work, unsettled something in people that they didn't quite have words for, and so they reached instead for pity, because pity at least came with a shape they understood. A grieving widow, fragile, in need of managing. That they knew how to talk about. A widow who could put a bullet through a man's hat brim at 200 yards and never touch a hair on his head that unsettled them in ways pity couldn't quite paper over. She rode past the church, past the saloon, where a couple of early drinkers already sat on the porch despite the hour, and reined up outside the dry goods store, where Wallace Hutchins, the proprietor, was already coming out to meet her the way he always did, on days she had meat to sell. "Morning, Mrs. Marlow." Wallace was a decent man, one of the few in town who never once made her feel small for the life she led. He looked over the deer lashed behind her saddle with the practiced eye of a man who'd been buying and selling game meat for 20 years. "Good clean kill. I'll give you same as last time, plus 2 bits more, on account of the cold folks. So'll want the extra meat before winter sets in proper. Appreciate it, Wallace." He helped her unload it, the 2 of them working in the easy, wordless partnership of people who'd done this particular dance a dozen times before. And while they worked, he glanced up at her once, twice, like a man working up to say something he wasn't sure he ought to. "Heard Kane rode out your way," he said finally low, "pitched just for her. Couple days back." Josie's hands went still on the rope for half a second before she made them keep moving. "News travels. In this town it does." Wallace's mouth tightened. "You want my advice, and I know you didn't ask for it. You're going to give it anyway." A faint, tired smile. "You know me too well." He straightened, wiping his hands on his apron. "Just watch yourself, Josie. Kane's a patient man when he wants something. Patient men are the dangerous kind. The impatient ones you see coming. I generally do watch myself, Wallace. Been doing it a while now. I know it." He held her eyes a moment, and something in his gaze was gentler than the town's usual pity. Something closer to genuine worry, from a man who'd known her father, who'd sold Nathaniel his first plow horse, who'd watched this young woman bury 2 men she loved and keep standing anyway. "Doesn't mean I can't worry on your account regardless." She thanked him for the money, tucked it away, and was turning to lead her horse back down the street when a small, breathless voice called out behind her. "Mrs. Marlow! Wait up!" Abel Boone came pelting down the boardwalk at the particular reckless speed of a boy of 16 who hadn't yet learned that dignity was worth slowing down for, hat nearly flying off his head, grinning wide enough to show the gap where he'd lost a tooth to a mule's kick 2 summers back. "Morning, Abel." Josie couldn't help the small, genuine smile that found her at the sight of him one of the few in town, if she was honest with herself. "Aren't you meant to be at the smithy this hour?" "Mr. Pruitt sent me for nails." Abel held up a small burlap sack as proof, though his attention was already sliding sideways, toward her saddle, toward the rifle riding easy in its scabbard. "That the Sharps? Can I look at her? You ask that every time. And every time you say, maybe next time." Abel fell into step beside her, matching her slow pace with the particular energy of a boy who had more of it than he knew what to do with. "You get that buck clean?" "Where at?" I've been trying to find sign up past the North Ridge for a week, and there ain't nothing up there but jackrabbits. Try lower, along the creek bed, past first light. They come down to drink about an hour after sunrise this time of year. Josie found, without quite meaning to, that talking to Abel about hunting was one of the few things left in her life that came easy and uncomplicated, no pity in it, no careful sideways glances, just a boy hungry to learn something. She happened to know better than anyone else in the county. Wind's coming out of the west most mornings now. Keep it in your face, not at your back, Mr. Pruitt says. Hunting's a fool's way to spend a morning when there's honest work needs doing. Mr. Pruitt's never gone hungry a day in his life to know the difference between a fool's way and a necessary one. She said it lighter than it might have landed, but there was truth underneath it, all the same. Abel laughed a real laugh. Easy, the kind that made Josie remember, briefly, painfully, that she'd once imagined a house full of children who might have laughed just like that, before the world had other plans for her. He walked with her as far as the edge of town, chattering about the smithy, about a new colt Otis Pruitt had taken in for shoeing, about nothing much at all. And Josie let him, grateful in a way she didn't examine too closely for the ordinary noise of it. At the edge of town, he peeled off toward the smithy, waving his sack of nails over his head. "You watch yourself out there, Mrs. Marlow," he called back, echoing Wallace's words without knowing it, in the careless way of a boy who'd heard grown folks say it enough times that it had become a kind of ritual farewell, emptied mostly of real meaning. Josie watched him go, and for just a moment, the weight she carried everywhere these days lightened by some small, unaccountable fraction. It didn't last. She rode back to the ranch by mid-morning, the sun climbing higher now, burning off the last of the frost, and spent the better part of the day at the kind of work that never seemed to end on a homestead this size, carried alone. Fence needed mending along the north pasture, where a section had come loose in last week's wind. The chicken coop needed shoring up against whatever fox or coyote had been sniffing around it 3 nights running. Firewood needed splitting, always splitting. The pile never quite large enough, no matter how much she added to it, because winter in Wyoming Territory did not forgive a family or a woman alone who came to it unprepared. She was elbow-deep in the work of hanging what remained of the deer to cure proper in the cool shade behind the barn, sleeves rolled, hands red from the cold and the work both, when she heard hoofbeats on the road, 3 riders, moving unhurried, the kind of unhurried that wasn't really about being in no rush. It was about wanting you to see them coming, wanting you to have time to feel it. Josie set down her knife, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked out to the fence line to meet them, because whatever this was, she wasn't going to face it from behind a door. The lead rider reined up first, broad-shouldered, silver at the temples, dressed better than any man had business, dressing on a ranch road, black coat, clean boots, despite the dust of the road, a silver ring on his right hand that caught the morning light when he touched his hat brim. He rode a fine bay gelding, 16 hands at least, the kind of horse that cost more than most homesteaders in the valley saw in a year. Silas Kane. She'd only met him twice before. Both times had left a taste in her mouth like something gone sour. "Mrs. Marlow." He said it warm, practiced warm. The kind of warm a man used when he'd said the same words to a dozen widows before her and expected them to work every time. "Fine morning, Mr. Kane." She didn't return the warmth. "You're a long way from your own land, am I?" He looked past her, out toward the creek, the way a man looks at something he's already decided belongs to him. There was something almost hungry in the way his eyes moved over her valley, not the frank, honest hunger of a man wanting land for what it could grow, but the colder, more patient hunger of a man who'd already decided the outcome and was simply waiting for the world to catch up to his decision. Funny thing about boundaries out here. Man forgets sometimes where his end and another man's begins. I don't forget. Flat. Final. This is Marlow land. Has been since my father filed the claim. Back before you'd built your first fence post. Your father. Something moved behind Kane's eyes when he said it there, and gone so fast, Josie almost missed it. Almost. A flicker of something that might have been old anger, or old grief, or both tangled together into something with no clean name. Ezra Marlow. Now there was a man who understood how this country worked. Did he? She kept her voice even, though something in the way he'd said her father's name too careful, too deliberate, snagged at her attention and refused to let go. Funny. I don't recall him ever selling anything he didn't want to. And I don't recall you two being friendly enough for you to speak on what he did or didn't understand." Kane smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "I'm not here to talk about selling, Mrs. Marlowe. I'm here as a neighbor. Concerned." He gestured, almost lazy, toward the creek behind her. "Water's been low this year, all up and down the valley. My herds are feeling it. Yours is small enough you probably haven't noticed. I've noticed everything I need to notice. Then you'll have noticed you're sitting on the last reliable creek for 6 miles. His voice didn't change. That was the part that unsettled her most. How easily the threat sat inside words that could have come from any friendly conversation, delivered in the same tone a man might use to remark on the weather. A woman alone, no husband, no sons. It's a hard thing. Holding ground like this by yourself, through a winter, through years of winters, with nobody to share the weight of it. I've held it fine. 2 years running since my husband passed, and 6 years before that since my father did. I imagine I'll go on holding it. For now." He said it soft, almost gentle, which made it worse. "I'd hate to see something happen to a woman I admire, Mrs. Marlowe. Country like this, it isn't always kind to folks who hold on too long to things they can't protect. Accidents happen. Weather turns. Cattle stray onto land they shouldn't, and fences that aren't kept up proper don't hold them back, and disputes follow. I'd rather see none of that happen to you." The 2 riders behind him hadn't spoken, didn't need to. Their silence did the talking. Kane's smile, wouldn't one of them, a lean, hollow-cheeked man with a scar through one eyebrow, kept his eyes on the barn the whole time, counting something, calculating something, in a way that made the hair on the back of Josie's neck rise before her conscious mind had caught up to why. The other, heavyset, kept glancing toward the house itself, toward the door, toward the windows, in the particular assessing way of a man who made his living, knowing how buildings were built and how easily they burned. Josie looked at each of them in turn, memorized their faces the way her father had taught her to memorize a herd before a storm, quick, complete, no wasted motion. She would know these men again, in daylight or dark, by the set of their shoulders alone if it came to that. "I'll take my chances holding what's mine," she said. "Good day, Mr. Kane." She turned, walked back toward the barn without looking back, spine straight, because she'd learned that too. The hard way you never let a man like that see your back tremble, even when it wanted to, even when every instinct she owned was screaming at her to keep him in sight, to never turn away from a wolf that hadn't yet decided whether to bite. Behind her, she heard Kane's horse shift, heard him exhale, almost amused. "Stubborn," he said, to no one in particular, though pitched just loud enough that he clearly meant for her to hear it, just like her father. Then the hoofbeats faded back down the road, unhurried as they'd come. Josie stood at the barn door a long moment after they'd gone, hand pressed flat against the rough wood, breathing. Because that was the thing about fear. It didn't announce itself all at once. It came in pieces. A comment here, a silence there, until one morning you woke up and realized you'd been afraid for so long you'd forgotten what the world felt like without it. She wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of seeing that fear. Not today. But that night, for the first time in longer than she could remember, she took the Sharps rifle down off its pegs above the hearth, and she didn't put it back up. Her father had filed the claim on this land in the spring of 1868, 3 years after the war ended, when a man with a wagon and a strong back and 160 acres of surveyed prairie could still walk into the land office in Cheyenne. And, for the price of a small filing fee and 5 years of proving up the ground, call something in this territory his own. Ezra Marlowe had walked out of that office with the deed folded careful in his breast pocket, and, or so he'd told Josie more than once over the years, had ridden the whole way back to the valley, grinning like a fool, unable to quite believe that a man born with nothing more than his own 2 hands could, in this country, end up owning something the government itself would stand behind. He'd built the first cabin that same year, 1 room, dirt floor, a fireplace he'd built stone by stone with a neighbor's help, traded for a week's labor hauling lumber. He'd proved up the claim exactly as the law required, 5 years living on it, working it, before the deed became fully and permanently his. And he'd added to it since, buying out a failed neighboring claim for a price that would have seemed a fortune to him once, and seemed, by the time Josie was grown, like the wisest money he'd ever spent. because it was that second parcel that held the deepest stretch of the creek, the water that never quite ran dry even in the cruelest of summers. It was that water, more than any other single thing, that had made the Marlow land worth more to Silas Kane than the ground itself. Josie understood the numbers of it well enough, from years of keeping her father's books, and then her husband's after him. Land alone, dry land unwatered, went for next to nothing in a territory as vast as Wyoming. A man could file a claim of his own, for the asking, if he had the grit to prove it up. But water was the one thing this country never made more of, no matter how many claims a man managed to file. A creek that ran 12 months a year, in a valley where most ran dry by August, was worth more to a cattle baron running thousands of head than gold buried in the ground. Because gold, at least, a man could do without. Cattle could not do without water, not for more than a day or two, before they began to sicken and die, and a herd the size of canes, scattered across range that stretched for miles in every direction, needed reliable water at more points than his own land alone provided. She thought of this, standing in the yard, in the cold hours after Kane's visit, turning the whole shape of it over in her mind, the way she might turn over a puzzle whose pieces she was only now beginning to properly see. Kane did not want her land because he coveted a widow's modest homestead for its own sake. He wanted the water, had likely wanted it for years, long before Nathaniel ever rode out toward that ravine on a business he'd called nothing urgent. And a man who wanted something that badly, who had that much money and that much reach, as Marsh had so carefully put it, was not a man inclined to let a widow's stubbornness stand between him and what he'd already decided belonged to him. She was 9 years old, the first time her father put a rifle in her hands. Not the Sharps, not yet. That came later, but a smaller piece, a used Henry with a stock cut down to fit her shoulders, bought secondhand off a trapper passing through who needed cash more than he needed a rifle. He'd never learned to shoot straight. Ezra Marlow had knelt behind her in the tall grass, outside their old cabin, his weathered hand steadying her arms, his voice low and even, the way he talked to spooked horses. "Breathe out," he'd told her. "Not all the way. Halfway. Then you hold it." Why halfway? Because all the way your body starts wanting the next breath before you're ready. And wanting things too early, that's how a man misses. Or a girl. He'd smiled then, rare for him, a smile that seemed to cost him something and be worth the cost regardless. Doesn't matter which. The rifle don't care who's holding it. Only cares whether the hand is steady. She remembered the smell of him, gun oil and wood smoke, and the particular sweetness of pipe tobacco he only smoked after supper, sitting on the porch step with his boots off, watching the light go purple over the western ridge. She remembered the way he never raised his voice, teaching her not once, not even when she flinched at the recoil so bad she nearly dropped the rifle in the dirt, not even when her first dozen shots went wide of anything worth hitting. Again was all he'd say, patient as stone. Patient in a way that few men in that hard country ever managed to be with anything. Her mother had died when Josie was 6, a fever that came on fast one bad winter and took her within a week, the way fevers sometimes did out on the frontier, far from any doctor worth the name. Josie remembered her mother mostly in fragments now, nearly 20 years gone, the smell of bread rising, a particular lullaby hummed low, hands that were softer than her father's ever were. What she remembered clearest of all was her father's face in the weeks after, gone gray and hollow, and the way he'd thrown himself into teaching her everything he knew, as if he'd decided, somewhere in his grief, that the only gift left worth giving his daughter was the whole of himself, unheld back, in case he too should someday be taken from her without warning. She hadn't understood that as a child. She understood it now, with a clarity that ached. By 11, she could hit a bottle at 50 yards, 3 times out of 5. By 14, 100 yards, and rarely missing. By 16, her father had stopped calling it practice and started calling it what it was, because by then, the two of them were riding out together before dawn, most mornings, hunting meat for a family that never seemed to have quite enough, in a territory where buffalo were growing scarcer every season, and a man's skill with a rifle stood between his family and a hard winter with an empty larder. Josie had stopped missing almost entirely by then. She remembered the pride on her father's face, the day she outshot 2 grown ranch hands. At a turkey shoot the town held one. 4th of July remembered too, the muttering afterward, the sideways looks, The particular discomfort a young woman's skill seemed to stir in men who'd never had to work half so hard to be taken seriously. Her father hadn't cared a whit for the muttering. He'd walked her home that evening, with his arm around her shoulders, grinning like a man half his age. "Let them talk," he'd said. "Talk's cheap. That turkey's not. You've got the gift," he told her. Another time, later, cleaning the sharps by lamplight at the kitchen table, the same rifle he'd carried since before she was born, purchased used off a buffalo outfit that had gone bust when the herds thinned past sustaining. "Your grandfather had it, back in Missouri, before any of us ever saw this country. I've got a piece of it. But you—" He looked at her, and his whole manner went very still, very serious, in a way that had frightened her a little at the time, though she hadn't understood why. "You've got all of it. More than I ever did. Is that good?" He was quiet a long moment, turning the rifle over in his hands, checking the action with the small, careful movements of a man who respected what he held. "It's a tool," he said finally, "like any other. A hammer builds a house or it breaks a skull. Same hammer. Depends entirely on the hand." He set the rifle down between them, careful, reverent, the way some men handled Bibles. "This gift of yours, it'll feed you. Might save your life someday, or somebody else's. It might, if the world turns hard enough, ask something of you that you'd rather it never asked. But Josie," he looked at her and his voice dropped low, the way it did on the rare occasions. He said something he needed her to remember, whole and entire, word for word, for the rest of her life. "Never let it decide who you are. You decide that. The rifle just listens. It'll do whatever the hand asks of it, good or ill, and never once complain nor judge. That's what makes it dangerous. Not the powder, the obedience." She hadn't understood him then. Not fully. She'd been 16, and the words had seemed like just another piece of her father's quiet, philosophizing. The sort of thing he said sometimes on long rides when the hunting was slow and his mind wandered toward matters larger than the trail ahead. There was another memory, older, that came to her, often in those years, one she hadn't thought of in some time, until the night of Kane's visit brought it drifting back unbidden. She'd been perhaps 13, riding with her father across a stretch of open plain 2 days east of the valley, when they'd come across the bones. Buffalo bones, hundreds of them, bleached white and scattered across a full mile of prairie, the remains of a herd some outfit of hide hunters had slaughtered years before and left to rot where they fell, taking only the hides and leaving the meat, tons of it, to waste under the sun. Her father had reined up at the edge of that bone field and sat his horse a long while, saying nothing, his face gone still in a way she'd rarely seen on him. "I hunted buffalo for 6 years before you were born," he told her finally, quiet, his eyes moving slow across the scattered white bones. "Good money in it then. Whole outfits, wagons full of hides, more meat than a man could ever eat in 10 lifetimes, and half of it left to spoil because there wasn't time nor need to save it. Not with more herds, always coming over the next rise." He shook his head slow. "I told myself, back then, the herds were too big to end. Whole country was too big. Man couldn't hardly see the edge of one herd from the middle of it. Some days they ran that thick and that wide. What happened to them? Men happened to them." He'd said it plain, without much bitterness, the way a man states a fact of weather, rather than a grievance. Not one man, not even one outfit. Just enough men, doing enough of what I was doing, for enough years running. Until one season the herds didn't come back thick like they always had, and the season after that, thinner still. And now, he gestured out at the bone field, at the emptiness of the plain beyond it. "Now you can ride 100 miles and count yourself lucky to see a dozen head where there used to be thousands." He'd turned his horse away from the bones then, and they'd ridden on in silence a good while before he spoke again. "That's why I quit the hide trade and took up this land instead," he said. "A man can hunt a deer, a dozen deer, 100 deer over a lifetime, and the land'll keep making more, so long as he takes only what he needs and leaves the rest be to breed again next season. But a man forgets that lesson easy when the money's good and the herd looks endless. Forgets it right up until the herd's gone, and then it's a sight too late to remember." He'd looked at her, serious in a way that had stayed with her all the years since. "Don't you ever let yourself believe a thing is too big to end, Josie, whether it's a herd of buffalo, or a stretch of good years, or anything else you're fool enough to take for granted. Everything ends, sooner or later. The only question worth asking is whether you took only what you needed along the way, or whether you took more and left the bones for somebody else to ride past and wonder at. She hadn't fully understood that lesson at 13 either. She understood it now, she thought, standing in her own yard with a corrupt sheriff's warning still ringing in her ears and a cattle baron's smile still sour in her memory. Understood that Silas Kane was, in his own way, precisely the kind of man her father had warned her against becoming. A man who saw an endless supply of what he wanted, and took, and never once paused to wonder what bones he might be leaving scattered behind him for somebody else to find. She was starting to understand her father now, 10 years later, in a valley he had built with his own hands, and left to her, along with a rifle that had never once, in 3 generations, been asked to do anything but feed a family. She wondered, lying awake that night with the sharps propped within reach for the first time in years, what her father would say if he could see the shape the question was taking in her now. Whether he would tell her to put it away, to trust the sheriff, to sell the land, and go somewhere safer somewhere. A woman alone wasn't expected to hold 200 acres against a man with more money and more reach than the whole rest of the valley combined. She didn't think he would, she thought. If she was honest with the ache that thought carried, that he would have told her exactly what he'd always told her. Again, Nathaniel Marlow had been a quiet man. Not shy quiet, the way still water is quiet. Deep enough that you didn't always see what moved underneath until it surfaced, and by the time it did, you'd already come to trust the stillness enough to be surprised by what it held. He'd come to Elk Creek from Ohio 4 years back with nothing but a wagon, a good set of carpentry tools, and an idea about building something honest in open country. An idea he'd talked about with a kind of quiet, unshowy conviction that Josie had found from the very first evening she met him, more persuasive than any amount of loud confidence could ever have been. She'd met him at a barn, dance the spring she turned 20, one of the rare occasions the whole valley turned out together, fiddle music and lantern light, and the particular giddy energy of a community, starved for company, finally allowed to cut loose for one evening. Josie had gone reluctantly, dragged along by a neighbor woman who'd insisted a young widow's daughter. For by then her father had also passed, 2 years back, heart giving out quiet in his sleep, oughtn't spend every evening alone, with nothing but a rifle for company. She remembered still, even now, even after everything, the memory undimmed by grief in a way that almost hurt more than if it had faded the particular way. Nathaniel had crossed the barn floor toward her, hat in his hands, looking like a man walking towards something that mattered more to him than his own comfort allowed him to easily manage. "I don't dance well," he'd said, ears going red under the lantern light. "But I'd be obliged if you'd let me try anyway." She'd laughed, really laughed, for the first time in longer than she could remember, and told him she didn't dance well either, which was a lie. Her father had taught her that too, in his way. But it had seemed the kinder thing to say. They danced 2 songs badly, and a third one considerably better, and by the end of the evening, Josie had found herself, to her own faint surprise, hoping he'd ask to walk her home. He had. She'd married him 8 months later, in the little church with the crooked steeple, her father's sharps rifle wrapped and stowed carefully away in the cabin for the day, replaced for those few hours by a bouquet of prairie flowers Nathaniel had picked himself. Badly, the stems too short, and the arrangement lopsided in a way that had made her laugh again. Right there at the altar, before the whole assembled town. For 3 years, life had been not easy. Nothing in that country was ever truly easy but good. Good in the way that mattered, the way that made the hard work worth doing. He'd built the second room onto the cabin with his own hands, humming off key while he worked, telling her it'd make a fine room for a child someday, his voice carrying a hope he never tried to hide from her, never once treated as anything but the plainest, most natural thing in the world to want. He'd never once flinched from the fact that his wife could outshoot every man in the county. Proud of it, if anything. Used to grin about it at the general store, when men doubted her, in a way that had made Josie love him a little more each time she heard it secondhand from somebody who'd been there to witness it. "My wife," he'd say, leaning against the counter with his thumbs hooked in his belt, "could put a bullet through your hat brim from 200 yards and never touch a hair on your head. Wouldn't recommend testing her, unless you're partial to losing that bet along with your hat." Josie closed her eyes against the memory now. the way she always did when it rose up, too vivid, too whole. Because it was easier to remember the good of him in pieces than all at once. All at once was too much. All at once threatened to undo 2 years of careful grinding work she'd done, just to be able to get up every morning and keep the ranch running without collapsing under the weight of what she'd lost. The morning he died had started like any other. He'd risen before dawn, same as always, dressed quiet in the gray light so as not to wake her, though she'd woken anyway, the way she always did when he moved through the room. She remembered she'd turned this particular memory over so many times in 2 years that its edges had gone smooth as a river stone, the way he'd sat on the edge of the bed to pull his boots on, and the way he'd looked back at her over his shoulder when he thought she was still half asleep, a look she hadn't been meant to see, soft and unguarded and full of something that, 2 years later, she still didn't have a word large enough for. He'd told her he was riding to town to meet with a land surveyor, some business about the boundary lines. Nothing urgent, he'd said, kissing her forehead at the door the way he did every morning, his hand lingering a moment against her cheek. Back by supper. He never made it to supper. The sheriff found his horse first, grazing loose along the ravine road near sundown, reins trailing, saddle empty. Found Nathaniel an hour after that, in the last gray light of evening, at the bottom of Coldwater Ravine, neck broken, boot still tangled in the stirrup where the fall had dragged him a dozen feet before the leather finally gave. A riding accident. That was what they'd called it. What everyone in Elk Creek still called it to this day, whenever her husband's name came up at all, which was rarer now, with each passing season. The way names of the dead always eventually fade from a town's daily conversation, however much they never fade from the hearts of those left, holding the grief. Josie had let them call it that for 2 years, but she'd ridden that ravine road herself, more times than she could count, in the months after, walking it slow, on foot, studying the ground, the way her father had taught her to study a trail, looking for what moved underneath the obvious story the way she'd looked for, what moved underneath a stone in a creek bed. And there was a thing about that road that never sat right with her, a thing she'd never said out loud to another living soul, not even to Wallace Hutchins, who she trusted more than most in that town. Nathaniel Marlow did not spook easy. His horse, a steady, sure-footed gelding he'd broken and trained himself, patient the way he was, patient with everything, did not spook easy either. And there was no loose gravel on that stretch of road bad enough to throw a rider who'd walked that trail 100 times before, in every season, in weather far worse than the clear, mild afternoon on which he died. She didn't have proof. Not yet. Just a question she'd buried so deep it had started to feel like grief instead of what it actually was. Suspicion. She remembered, too, a detail she'd never told anyone, because it had seemed too small, too easily explained away to be worth the trouble of raising it, and being told gently that grief made a person see shadows where there was only ordinary sunlight. There had been a second set of hoofprints on that ravine road, that day, going the same direction Nathaniel had gone, and returning before he did. She'd found them herself, weeks after, faint but still readable, to eyes trained since childhood to read exactly this kind of sign. A second rider. Someone who'd ridden out toward the ravine ahead of her husband and ridden back alone. She'd told herself, for 2 years, that it could have been anyone. A ranch hand. A drifter. Somebody with entirely innocent business on a public road. She was no longer sure she believed that. She wasn't certain she ever had. The days after Kane's visit passed the way. Most days on the Marlow ranch passed full, hard quiet, each one bleeding into the next with the particular sameness of a life built around necessary chores rather than choices. Josie mended fence, the north pasture section, holding at last against the wind, split wood enough to last the coming cold, the woodpile growing by careful degrees, never quite fast enough to outrun her own worry about the winter ahead. Rode the property line twice a day now, instead of once, rifle across her saddle instead of stowed in its scabbard, eyes moving constantly to the tree line, to the ridge, to anywhere a man might wait and watch unseen. She told herself it was only sense, only a woman being careful, alone, with a man like Kane sniffing around her water. She didn't let herself say the other word, the one that sat underneath the sense, patient, waiting, growing a little larger with each quiet, watchful day. Afraid. She noticed it in small ways. First, the way fear always seemed to announce itself before she was willing to call it by its proper name. She found herself listening harder at odd hours, pausing mid-chore at some ordinary sound, a branch cracking, a horse shifting its weight in the barn, that would never once have caught her attention before Kane's visit. She took to walking the property line at dusk, as well as dawn, now rifle in hand, studying the tree line the way she'd once studied a hunting trail, looking for anything that didn't belong. She caught herself, twice, reaching for the rifle, at nothing more than the sound of wind moving through the cottonwoods along the creek, and each time she had to stand a moment afterward, breathing slow, reminding herself that jumping at every shadow would wear her down faster than any enemy Kane could send against her. The second night after his visit, she woke twice from sleep, so shallow it hardly deserved the name. Certain. Both times she'd heard something moving near the barn, and both times found nothing. When she checked only the ordinary dark, the ordinary quiet, her own heart hammering at ordinary silence as though it were a threat. She began, without quite deciding to, sleeping in her clothes, boots close by the bed, the way she imagined soldiers must have slept during the war her father had survived and rarely spoke of. She told herself this was simple prudence. She told herself a great many things. Those 3 days, most of them only half believed even as she thought them, because underneath the careful daily business of fence mending and wood splitting and feeding what stock she kept, a colder, more honest part of her mind had already begun doing arithmetic of an entirely different kind than the one she used for her ledgers, counting exits, counting sightlines from the house, counting how long it would take a man on foot to cross from the tree line to her door, and finding each time she ran the numbers that the answer troubled her considerably more than she let herself admit even in the privacy of her own thoughts. On the second of those 3 days, Wallace Hutchins made the ride out himself, a thing he hadn't done in longer than Josie could easily remember, his wagon creaking up the road mid-morning, with a crate of supplies she hadn't ordered riding in the bed behind him. "Didn't ask for this," she said, coming out to meet him, more puzzled than wary. "Didn't charge you for it either." Wallace climbed down slow, a heavy-set man in his 50s, whose knees had never quite forgiven him for 30 years of hauling feed sacks, extra powder, some tinned goods. Figured a woman keeping watch through the night might find her larder running thinner than usual, and might not think to ride into town to fix it till it was already a problem. Josie studied him a long moment, understanding arriving slow. "You heard something." "Heard plenty. This is a small town, Josie, and men talk loose in a saloon when they've had 2 drinks and think nobody worth minding is listening." He set the crate down on her porch step, straightened with a wince, pressed a hand to the small of his back. 2 of Kane's hands were in Sunday night, boasting some, the way young fools do when they want to seem bigger than they are. Talk of a job coming. Talk of a widow who needed reminding what was good for her. His jaw tightened. "Didn't name you outright. Didn't need to. You should have told me sooner. I'm telling you now." He met her eyes, steady, the same gentle worry she'd seen in him 100 times over the years, since before her father died, since before Nathaniel. "I'm an old man who sells flour and nails, Josie. I've got no rifle worth the name and no stomach left for what men like Kane's hired hands are built for. But I can bring you supplies, and I can keep my ears open in that store from now till whenever this settles, and I can tell you plain when I hear something worth hearing. That's the whole of what I've got to offer. I'd be obliged if you'd let it be enough." Something in Josie's chest, tight for 3 days straight, eased by some small fraction, at that, not because the warning changed anything she hadn't already half suspected, but because it was, she realized, the first time since Kane's visit that somebody else in this valley had stood in her yard and offered help instead of a warning, dressed up to look like one. "It's enough, Wallace," she said. "More than enough. Thank you." He nodded, awkward with the thanks the way plain men often were, and climbed back onto his wagon seat with the particular care of a body that had worked hard its whole life and intended to keep working regardless of what its joints thought about the matter. "Watch yourself," he called back. The same words Abel had used, the same words the whole town seemed to reach for when they didn't have better ones to offer. Coming from Wallace, though, riding away from a crate of supplies he hadn't been asked to bring, the words carried a different weight than they had from anyone else who'd said them. On the 3rd day after Kane's visit, Sheriff Judd Marsh rode out. He was a heavyset man, going soft in the middle the way lawmen sometimes did in towns, quiet enough not to test them. With a mustache he was vain about waxed and combed. Every morning, Josie had heard, longer than most men in the territory, spent on the whole rest of their appearance, combined in a badge he wore, like it was doing him a favor rather than the other way around. Josie had known him 12 years since before Nathaniel, since her father's time, back when Marsh had been a younger, leaner deputy under a sheriff, long since retired and moved on, and she'd never once trusted the particular way his eyes moved when he was about to say something he didn't believe. Afternoon, Josie. He didn't get down off his horse. Never did anymore, she'd noticed when he came out here, not in the 2 years since Nathaniel's death. As if some part of him wanted to be ready to leave fast, the moment things turned uncomfortable, and things, in his experience of her, generally did. Came to see how you're settling. Settling fine, Sheriff. Heard Kane paid you a visit. He said it careful. Testing the ground before he put weight on it, the way a man tests river ice in early spring, uncertain whether it will bear him. He did. He's not a man you want for an enemy, Josie. Marsh's eyes slid off to the side, toward the creek. Same place Kane's had gone 3 days before, as though the two men had rehearsed the same small, telling gesture between them, without either quite realizing it. Man's got more cattle than the rest of this county combined. More money. More, he searched for the word, didn't quite find one he liked, settled for a lesser one, the way men often did when the true word sat too close to something they'd rather not name aloud. More reach. And maybe there's wisdom in hearing him out. About the water. Marsh shifted in his saddle, wouldn't meet her eyes now, studying instead some point over her left shoulder, as though the barn had suddenly become a matter of great interest to him. Nobody'd think less of you for selling, Josie. A woman alone, out here there's no shame in it. Plenty of widows before you have made the same sensible choice and gone on to fine, comfortable lives elsewhere. Is that concern talking, Sheriff? She said quietly. Or somebody else's message? His jaw tightened. Just slightly. Just enough for a woman trained since childhood to read the smallest tells in a man's stillness to catch it plainly. I'm only saying what I'd say to any. You've never once ridden out here in 12 years to ask how I'm settling. She held his eyes, didn't blink, didn't let her voice rise, even a fraction, though something hot and furious was building behind her ribs with every careful, evasive word out of his mouth. Not when Nathaniel died, though you rode out then, I'll grant you, to deliver the news and never once came back after to see how a grieving widow managed alone through that first hard winter. Not once in the 2 years since, through every season, through every hardship this ranch has thrown at me. So don't sit that horse and tell me this is concern, Judd Marsh. I've known you too long and too well for that particular lie to land. For a moment, something flickered across Marsh's face, guilt, maybe, or the closest thing a man like him kept in stock, buried under years of small, comfortable compromises he'd made with himself, about what a badge did and didn't obligate a man to do. Then it was gone, folded away behind the badge, behind the mustache, behind 12 years of a man choosing the easier side of every hard question, because the easier side had never once, in his experience, cost him anything he wasn't willing to pay. Just watch yourself, Josie, he said, low, and there was something underneath it, not quite a threat, not quite a warning, some third thing that had no clean name, born of a man caught between what he knew and what he'd allowed himself to become. Country like this, things happen to folks who dig their heels in too deep. He turned his horse before she could answer, rode off without looking back faster than he'd arrived, as though putting distance between himself and the conversation might also put distance between himself and whatever conscience it had, briefly, uncomfortably, stirred. Josie stood at her fence a long time. After the dust settled, turning his words over the way she'd turn over a stone in a creek bed, looking for what moved underneath. Things happen to folks who dig their heels in too deep. She thought of Coldwater Ravine, of a husband who didn't spook easy, on a horse that didn't spook easy, on a road he'd ridden 100 times, of a second set of hoofprints, faint but real, going out and coming back alone. And for the first time in 2 years, the question she'd buried so long it had calcified into grief cracked open, just slightly, just enough to let something colder than sorrow through. What if it hadn't been an accident at all? What if the sheriff himself had known, or suspected, or been told to look no further than the easiest story? The whole 2 years she'd been quietly, privately wondering. alone, with no one to share the wondering with. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark, listening to the house settle around her, the particular creaks and sighs of a home built by two men who'd both, in their own ways, meant to keep her safe inside it. Both of them gone now, both of them leaving her alone with whatever came next. The wind picked up sometime past midnight, rattling the loose shutter on the north window that she kept meaning to fix and never quite found the time for. And every small sound seemed, that night, to carry a weight it hadn't carried the night before. Because that was the shape of her life now, wasn't it? Everyone who'd ever stood between her and the world, gone. Her mother, when Josie was small, fever taking her quick and cruel one bad winter, leaving behind only fragments of memory, grown fainter with each passing year. Her father, 8 years back, heart giving out in his sleep, peaceful at least, the one mercy in a hard life, though the grief of losing him had nearly broken her regardless, coming as it did only 2 years before she'd met Nathaniel and begun, slowly, cautiously, to imagine a future again. Nathaniel himself, 2 years gone now, the manner of his leaving still an open wound she'd never allowed to close, because some deep, stubborn part of her refused to believe the official story, refused to let him become simply an accident, a bit of bad luck on a familiar road, until it was just her, just Josie and 200 acres, and a rifle that had outlived every man who'd ever carried it before her. She got up sometime past midnight, stood in the front room in her nightclothes, moonlight coming pale and thin through the window, filtered gray through clouds that promised more cold weather by morning, and looked at the Sharp's rifle where it hung now within easy reach of the door, close enough to reach in 3 quick strides from her bed. Her father's voice came back to her, unbidden, the way it always did in the dark hours when her guard was down and her mind, exhausted from the effort of staying strong through daylight, finally let its walls down. It's a tool. Depends entirely on the hand. She thought about Kane's smile, warm and false as painted glass, about Sheriff Marsh's eyes sliding away from hers, again and again 3 days running now, as though he couldn't quite bear to look at what his own silence had cost, or might yet cost, about a husband who didn't spook easy, dead at the bottom of a ravine he knew better than his own front porch, and a second set of hoofprints that had never belonged to any story anyone in this town had ever bothered to tell her. And some quiet, cold certainty settled into her, then not quite decided yet, not quite ready to be spoken aloud, even to herself, even in the privacy of an empty house at midnight, that whatever was coming for the Marlow land, it was not going to find an easy widow waiting for it. Not anymore. Perhaps it never truly had, though it had taken her 2 long years of grief to remember that fact about herself. She went back to bed, didn't sleep, not really. Just lay there in the dark, listening the way she'd been taught to listen since she was 9 years old, kneeling in tall grass with her father's hands steadying her arms, waiting, though she wouldn't have called it that yet, not even to herself. Because somewhere out past the ridge line, in the dark, 3 men were already checking the loads in their revolvers and counting out among themselves in low businesslike voices exactly how much Silas Kane had promised to pay for a job that was meant, by every calculation they'd made, to be simple. They had not accounted, in any of their calculations, for the particular nature of the woman they'd been sent to frighten. They came just past 2 in the morning, 3 nights after Marsh's visit, on a night chosen with obvious care. No moon to speak of. Clouds thick enough to swallow the stars whole, rolled in off the mountains that afternoon and settled low over the valley by nightfall. The kind of dark a man chooses on purpose, when what he's planning doesn't want witnesses and doesn't want a target with time enough to see him coming. Josie woke before she understood why. Not a sound, exactly. Something underneath, sound the particular wrongness of silence, where there should have been the small night noises of a working ranch. No owl calling from the barn eaves, where one had nested every autumn for as long as she could remember. No shift and stamp of the horse in its stall, restless the way horses always were in full dark, sensitive to things human ears couldn't catch. Every animal on the property had gone still at once. She was out of bed before she'd finished the thought, moving low, moving quiet, years of her father's training taking over before her mind had even caught up to her body. Because that was the other thing he'd taught her, out in the grass before dawn, patient as stone. So many years ago it sometimes felt like another woman's life entirely. Your body knows danger before your mind agrees to believe it. Don't wait for your mind. Trust the body. She reached the window, looked out into the dark, eyes straining against the near-total blackness, pupils already beginning the slow adjustment that would take. She knew from long practice nearly 10 full minutes to complete properly. 10 minutes she did not have. And saw them anyway, or rather sensed them, shapes darker than the darkness around them, moving low along the tree line at the edge of the property, working their way toward the barn with the unhurried, methodical patience of men who had done this kind of work before and expected no trouble from what waited inside the house. 3 shapes. Horses left behind, tied off out of earshot along the road, which told her everything she needed to know about what kind of men these were. Men who planned. Men who'd done this before, more than once, in more than one valley, against more than one family, who'd stood between Silas Kane and something he wanted. Her heart was slamming against her ribs so hard she could feel it in her throat, a wild, frantic drumbeat that seemed, for one terrible moment, loud enough to give her away through the very walls of the house. Because this was different. This wasn't Kane's smiling threats over a fence line, all careful words and no true danger yet. This wasn't Marsh's sliding eyes and useless warnings. This was men in the dark, coming for her land, coming maybe for her life, and there was no fence lines of politeness left standing between her and whatever came next. Every careful assumption she'd built her life around these 2 years, that this was a hard country but a fundamentally lawful one, that grief was the worst it had left to deal her, was about to be tested against 3 armed men closing in on her home in the dead of night. She didn't reach for a lamp, didn't dare. Light would only mark her position, hand the advantage entirely to men who already knew the ground far better than she'd hoped, having clearly scouted it in daylight before choosing tonight. She reached for the sharps. Her hands were shaking. She let them shake. Her father had taught her that too, once, half lawing at some fool cowhand who'd claimed real marksmen never felt fear, sitting around a campfire, telling tall tales the way men did. Fear's not the enemy, Josie. Fear that stops your hands, that's the enemy. Let it shake. Just don't let it choo-choos. She loaded by feel in the dark, fingers moving through motions rehearsed so many thousands of times over 17 years that they required no conscious thought at all, which was its own small mercy, because her conscious mind had very little left to spare. Cartridge sliding home with a small, certain click that sounded, to her own straining ears, louder than a gunshot, loud enough surely to carry across the yard and give her away. It didn't. The men kept moving, unaware, toward the barn. Then she moved to the door, eased it open slow, careful of the hinge that always complained if rushed, and slipped out into the yard low and silent, barefoot in the cold, frost-wet grass, rifle held tight against her chest, every sense pulled taut in a way that went beyond even the stillness she found before a hunting shot. This was that same stillness, she realized distantly, some detached corner of her mind still capable of observation even through the roaring fear, the same half-second of held breath her father had taught her, except stretched now across minutes instead of seconds, and with far higher stakes than any deer had ever carried. 3 men, moving toward the barn where the horse and the last of her livestock were stabled, one carrying what looked like a torch, unlit yet, waiting, a coil of rag wrapped tight around its head, soaked, she'd learn later, in coal oil. Fire. They meant to burn her out. Something in Josie went very quiet then, very clear. The fear didn't leave it, never fully left. Not that night, not ever again after it. She'd come to understand in the weeks that followed, but something colder and steadier rose up underneath it, filled the space fear left behind, and steadied her hands better than any calm ever could have managed on its own. She thought of her father's voice, clear across 17 years, close, as if he stood beside her in the dark. Breathe out. Not all the way. Halfway. Then you hold it. She dropped to one knee in the shadow of the porch post, the wood rough and cold against her shoulder where she braced. Brought the sharps up, the familiar weight settling into her hands like an old, trusted friend, arriving exactly when needed. Found the nearest shape in the dark, the one with the torch, the one who meant to take the last thing she had left in this world. Her father's ranch, her husband's careful carpentry, the only home she had ever truly known, and burn it to ash while she watched, helpless, from wherever they intended to leave her once the work was done. And she held her breath. The shot cracked across the yard like the sky splitting open, echoing off the barn wall and rolling out across the valley into the dark. The man with the torch went down without a sound, the unlit brand falling from his hand into the wet grass, hissing out before it ever caught, its thread extinguished before it could ever properly begin. For one full second, the night went utterly, perfectly still. Even the wind seemed to hold itself back. Then the other two scattered, one toward the barn, drawing his revolver, shouting something Josie couldn't make out over the roar of her own pulse in her ears. Some panicked curse or warning to his fallen companion who could no longer hear it. The other broke for the tree line, already firing blind into the dark toward the house, muzzle flash strobing bright and sudden against the black. A bullet splintered the porch post 6 inches from her shoulder, sending a spray of wood fragments stinging across her cheek. She didn't flinch. Didn't have time to. Her hands were already working the lever, cartridge sliding home, and some part of her mind that had gone strange and calm and far away noted, almost distant, almost as though watching herself from some safe height above the scene, that her father had built this exact readiness into her, year after patient year, for exactly this. For the moment when everything a person had left in the world came down to whether their hands would hold steady when it mattered most. She fired again. The man by the barn dropped his revolver, clutching his shoulder, cursing loud enough to wake the whole valley, stumbling back toward where the horses waited, tied along the road. His earlier confidence entirely gone now, replaced with the particular panicked scramble of a man who had believed this job would be easy and was rapidly, painfully, learning otherwise. The third man, the one in the tree line, kept firing wild, kept shouting for the others to fall back. Fall back. She's armed, damn it. Fall back. And Josie was already moving, already reloading, already sliding sideways along the porch to break whatever angle he had on her, low and fast. Years of instinct guiding her body faster than conscious thought could have managed. Because this was the last lesson her father had ever taught her, out in the grass before dawn. So long ago she'd almost forgotten it, until tonight brought it roaring back, with a clarity sharper than any memory she owned. Never let them find your stillness. Moving targets live longer than brave ones. She fired a third time, not to kill now, just to answer, just to make the dark understand that whatever these men had ridden out here expecting, an easy widow, a frightened woman alone, unarmed and unprepared, was not what they were going to find waiting for them tonight, nor any night after. The third man broke from the tree line at a dead run, following the others toward the horses, abandoning whatever remained of the job they'd been sent to do. Within a minute, hoofbeats were pounding away down the road, fading fast into the dark they'd come from, 3 horses driven hard by men who had, by every measure that mattered, failed. Josie stayed low, behind the porch post. A long moment after the sound had gone, rifle still raised, hands still shaking. Because now, with the danger past, the shaking finally came for her the way it hadn't dared, while the men were still there to see it, a violent, full-body trembling that had nothing left to do with courage and everything to do with the simple animal fact of having survived something that might very easily have gone the other way. She stayed like that, kneeling in the frost-wet grass with her father's rifle in her lap, until the gray light of dawn began creeping up over the ridge, painting the valley slowly back into visible shape and colors, as though the night itself were reluctant to give up what it had witnessed. Then, slowly, stiffly, her whole body aching from hours held tense and motionless, she stood. In the pale first light, she walked the yard, found the torch, half burned at one end where the wet grass had smothered what little flame it had managed to catch before falling, coal oil still sharp and acrid in her nose when she bent to examine it. Found blood, not much, but enough dark against the trampled earth near the barn door, where the man she'd hit in the shoulder had stumbled toward his horse, leaving a trail she could have followed a mile in daylight if she'd chosen to. And near the tree line, half hidden in the frost-silvered brush where the third man had fired wild before running, she found what one of them had dropped in his hurry to flee. A leather tally book, small, worn at the corners, the kind ranch hands carried tucked in a coat pocket to track herd counts and wages owed, the kind that fell easily from a running man's pocket, without him ever noticing the loss until it was far too late to go back for it. She opened it with hands that had finally, mostly, stopped shaking, though the cold morning air still made them clumsy at the small task. Names, numbers, dates going back several months, entries in a cramped, businesslike handrecording, head counts, wages, supplies drawn against future pay. And at the top of every page, stamped in ink, gone slightly faded but still perfectly legible, a brand mark she recognized instantly because she'd seen it burned into the hide of 1,000 head of cattle grazing land that bordered her own, seen it on the gateposts of the largest spread in the valley, seen it, 3 days past, on the silver ring Silas Kane had worn on his right hand while he sat his fine bay, gelding at her fence line, and spoke of accidents and disputes in a voice as warm and false as painted glass. The Kane Cattle Company. Josie stood in the gray morning light for a long time, holding the little book in hands that had, 2 years ago, belonged to a woman who thought the worst of her life was already behind her. A woman who'd buried a husband and a father in the space of 3 years and told herself that was surely the whole of what this hard country had left to take from her. That grief, however heavy, was at least a debt already paid in full. She understood now, standing there with proof in her hands, and gunsmoke still faint in the cold morning air, that she'd been wrong. The worst hadn't come yet, but it had shown its hand, plainly, undeniably, in a way that no amount of Marsh's careful evasions or Kane's warm, false smiles could talk her back out of believing. Josephine Marlow, daughter of Ezra Marlow, widow of Nathaniel Marlow, the woman half this county still pitied as a fragile thing to be managed and married off and moved gently but firmly out of the way of men. With larger plans closed the tally book, tucked it inside her coat, against her heart, and looked out across the valley her father had built, with his own 2 hands, the same valley 3 men had tried, and failed, to burn out from under her, in the dead of night. She thought of Kane's smile, of Marsh's sliding eyes, and his warning that had sounded, in hindsight, less like concern, and considerably more like foreknowledge, of a husband who didn't spook easy, dead at the bottom of a ravine that had never made sense, and a second set of hoofprints she had never been able to explain away, no matter how many times she'd tried. The sheriff's warning was still ringing in her ears, days later, and she no longer heard it as concern at all. She saddled her horse within the hour and rode for town, the tally book wrapped in oilcloth and tucked inside her coat, the sharps riding easy across her saddle in plain sight, no longer scabbarded away out of politeness. Let the town see it. Let them talk. She was done pretending the last 4 days hadn't happened. By the time she reached Elk Creek, the sound of last night's gunfire had already beaten her there, carried across the still valley air, far enough that half the town had heard it, faint and distant, and spent the morning trading uneasy guesses about its source. Otis Pruitt was first to spot her riding in, stepping out from the forge with his one good arm still black to the elbow with soot, his face going tight with worry. The moment he took in the state of her hair, still loose from sleep she hadn't gotten, a shallow scrape along one cheek from the flying wood splinters, she hadn't yet noticed herself. Josie. He crossed the street quick, wiping his hand uselessly on an apron already ruined by a morning's work. That gunfire last night out past the North Ridge, wasn't it? That direction, I marked it soon as I heard it. It was my place, Otis. She said it plain, no dressing it up, because dressing it up had never once made a hard thing easier to carry, only harder to set down later. 3 of Kane's men came at me in the dark, meant to burn me out. Otis went very still. He'd lost his left arm below the elbow at a place called Antietam, more than 20 years back now, a fact he rarely spoke of but never fully set down either, and his whole bearing in that moment carried the particular weight of a man who had seen enough of what men did to each other in the dark to recognize the shape of it instantly, without need of further explanation. You hurt? No. They came off worse than I did. She didn't elaborate further, not yet, not until she'd spoken to the one man in this town, whose job it was to hear it first. Where's the sheriff? Otis's jaw tightened in a way that told her, before he'd said a word, exactly how much faith he placed in Judd Marsh doing right by what she was about to tell him. Office. Same as always. He hesitated, then added low, careful, glancing once down the street, as though the words themselves might carry too far if spoken at full voice. Watch how much you tell him, Josie. I don't say that lightly. But there's talk, has been for a while now, about where the sheriff's loyalties truly sit, and it isn't talk I care much for, given what it might mean for you. Abel Boone came running up behind him before Josie could ask what exactly that talk consisted of, breathless, wide-eyed, having clearly heard enough of the exchange from a distance to piece together the shape of it. "Mrs. Marlow, is it true? Kane's men came at your place?" The boy's usual easy grin was entirely gone, replaced by something older than his 16 years had any business wearing. "I'll come out and help stand watch, if you'll have me. I ain't much with a rifle yet, but I can holler loud enough to wake the whole valley if trouble comes again." Something in Josie's chest ached at that. Sharp and sudden, the plain, uncomplicated courage of a boy offering the only thing he had to give, without a second thought for his own safety. It was, she thought, very much the kind of thing her father would have done at 16, and very much the kind of thing this hard country seemed determined to ask of people far too young to be asked it. "I'll keep that offer in mind, Abel. For now, I need you to do something else for me. Can you do that?" He nodded fast, eager. "Keep your eyes open around town. Anybody asking after my place, after my movements, anybody you don't know riding through you, come tell Otis here, or Wallace at the dry goods. Straight away. Don't approach them yourself. Just watch. And remember, and tell somebody. Can you manage that?" "Yes, ma'am." He said it solemn, and for once didn't argue to be given something more dangerous, which told Josie plainer than anything else could have just how shaken the boy truly was by what he'd heard. She left them both at the forge and rode the last stretch to the sheriff's office alone. Judd Marsh was behind his desk when she came through the door, tally book still wrapped in her coat, and whatever color remained in his face drained further the moment he took in the sight of her, the scrape on her cheek, the rifles in her hand rather than left outside with her horse, the particular set of her jaw that told any man with sense to be very careful indeed about what he said next. "Josie, what in? 3 men came onto my land last night." She set the tally book down on his desk. Unwrapped now, open to the first page bearing the Kane brand mark, plain and unmistakable. "Meant to burn me out of house and home while I slept. I put one down with a wound that'll need tending somewhere in this county. Today or tomorrow, if you care to go looking." The other 2 ran and left this behind them. Marsh stared down at the tally book a long moment. Didn't touch it. Didn't ask a single question. A proper lawman ought to have asked first. Who, when, how many? Was she certain of the brand? Could she describe the men? The kind of questions that came natural to a man genuinely surprised by what he was hearing. He only stared and swallowed and finally looked up at her with eyes that had, for just a moment, entirely stopped pretending. "You're certain it was Kane's men?" "I'm certain of a brand I've seen on 1,000 head of his cattle, and a name stamped plain on every page of this book. You tell me what else it could mean, Sheriff, and I'll listen." He didn't answer that, sat back slow in his chair, one hand coming up to smooth his mustache in the nervous, unconscious gesture Josie had watched him make 100 times over 12 years, always in the moments he was buying himself time to decide what version of the truth he meant to tell. I'll look into it," he said finally, and even he seemed to hear how thin the words sounded hanging in the small office between them. "Can't move too fast on an accusation this size, Josie. Man like Kane. There'll need to be proof enough to stand up, witnesses, more than just a book that could have been planted to make trouble, planted." She said the word flat, disbelieving, watching something in her chest that had been holding on to some last thin thread of faith in this man. Finally, quietly, "Let go. You think I shot a man and invented 3 riders in the dark to plant evidence against my own neighbor, Judd. I didn't say that. I'm only saying a case needs building proper, and I know exactly what you're saying." She picked the tally book back up off his desk, wrapped it again in the oilcloth, tucked it back inside her coat, because she understood now, with a clarity that felt almost like relief after 2 years of uncertainty, that she would find no help in this office. Perhaps she never would have, whatever proof she eventually brought him. "I came here to report a crime, Sheriff. I've reported it. What you choose to do with that report is yours to answer for, now and whenever this valley finally gets around to asking harder questions about where your loyalties truly sit." She left him sitting there, mustache still between his fingers, and didn't look back. Outside, the morning had turned bright and cold, the kind of hard, clean Wyoming light that made everything look sharper-edged than it truly was. Otis and Abel were still waiting near the forge, watching her come, and she didn't need to tell either of them how the meeting had gone. It was written plain enough across her face. Figured as much, Otis said quietly when she reached them. I'm sorry for it, Josie. Man used to be better than this, or so I thought once, back when he first pinned that badge on. Something's changed him along the way, or something's bought him. Can't rightly say which, nor does it much matter to the outcome. No, Josie agreed. It doesn't. She rode home alone that afternoon, the tally book heavy against her ribs, the valley spread out, gold and green, and utterly indifferent around her, and understood, with the same cold clarity that had steadied her hands in the dark 12 hours before, that whatever came next, she would be facing it largely on her own resources. The law in Elk Creek had shown her, plainly, which side of this fight it stood on. That understanding didn't frighten her the way it might have once. If anything, it settled something in her that had been unsettled for 2 long years, the last of her uncertainty about how carefully she needed to hold on, to hope that somebody else would fix this for her. Nobody was coming to fix it for her. She'd known that, somewhere underneath, since the morning the sheriff first rode out to tell her Nathaniel wasn't coming home. She'd simply needed 4 days and a night of gunfire to finally admit it plain. Josie carried the Sharps rifle back inside, cleaned it careful and slow at the kitchen table the way her father had taught her. Hands steadier now with each familiar motion, oiled the action until it moved smooth as water, smooth as it had moved for 3 generations of Marlows, who had never once, until last night, needed it for anything but feeding a family. Then she hung it back on its pegs above the hearth, not to put it away, just to have it close, and ready for whatever came next. Because whatever Silas Kane thought he'd started last night, whatever quiet, frightened grief he expected to find waiting for him at the end of it, he was about to learn the same hard truth her father had tried to teach her once in the tall grass before dawn. Kneeling behind a 9-year-old girl with a cut-down rifle and more patience than most men ever managed to find for anyone, let alone a daughter the rest of the world would have told him to raise differently. A tool is only ever as dangerous as the hand that holds it. And Josephine Marlow's hands, after 2 long years of grieving quietly and asking her hardest questions only in the privacy of her own sleepless nights, had finally stopped shaking and had, in their place, found something considerably harder and considerably more dangerous to the men who had mistaken her silence for 2 long years for surrender. Somewhere out on the road that led into Elk Creek, unnoticed yet by anyone in town, a lone rider was already approaching. From the east, a stranger nobody in the valley had seen before, moving slow and watchful, the particular unhurried way of a man who'd spent a lifetime reading trouble before it found him, weathered hands resting easy near a gun belt worn smooth with long use, eyes taking in the shape of the land the way a man takes in ground he expects before long to have good cause to know very well. He didn't know Josephine Marlow's name yet, but before the week was out, he would. And Silas Kane, riding back from his own ranch house that same gray morning to check on 3 men who had not yet reported the outcome of the previous night's work, was about to learn that the widow he had, so carefully, so patiently, decided to underestimate, was not the easy problem he had believed her to be. She was, in fact, only just beginning. The valley lay quiet in the gray morning light, smoke rising thin and steady from the cabin chimney, the creek running low but unbroken along its familiar course toward pastures that still, for now, belonged to a Marlow. Somewhere behind that quiet, 3 men were nursing wounds and a bruised confidence, riding back toward a ranch house, grand enough to have never once needed to fear the kind of trouble it had sent out into the dark. And somewhere ahead of it, on a road still some miles distant, a stranger rode on unhurried, watching the shape of the hills change around him, carrying with him a piece of history neither Josephine Marlow nor Silas Kane yet knew was about to ride straight into the middle of their quarrel. Elk Creek would not stay quiet much longer. But for one more gray morning at least, it held its breath the way a valley does in the hour, just after a storm has passed, and just before the next one gathers on the horizon, unseen but already, unmistakably, on its way. The stranger rode into Elk Creek 2 days after the raid on the Marlow ranch, and the town noticed him the way it noticed everything slow, sideways, 6 conversations pausing at once as he passed. Tall, weathered past his years, though he couldn't have been much past 40, a gray coat gone pale at the shoulders from sun, a gun belt worn smooth with use, riding low and easy on his hip, the way a man carries a thing he stopped thinking about because his hands have long since stopped needing to think. He didn't stop at the saloon. Didn't stop at the sheriff's office either, though his eyes moved across it once, slow cataloging. He stopped outside the dry goods store, tied his horse, went in and bought coffee, salt, a box of cartridges, and asked, in a voice pitched low and unhurried, whether Wallace Hutchins knew where he might find the Marlow ranch. Wallace, who trusted almost nobody in this business on principle, found himself answering anyway, because something in the stranger's manner didn't ask to be trusted. It simply was. "You know the family?" Wallace asked. "Knew the father," the stranger said. "Long time back." That was all he offered. It was enough. Josie was in town herself that same morning, restocking what the last 2 hard days had cost her: powder, salt for curing meat, a length of rope to replace what had frayed through in the barn. She'd left the sharps across her saddle in plain sight, same as she had since the night of the raid, and she felt the town's eyes on it everywhere she walked. Let them look. She was done pretending. She was outside the feed store, loading a sack of grain onto her horse, when 2 of Kane's men found her. Not the same 3 from the raid. These were different day riders, the kind Kane kept on for legitimate ranch work and used when it suited him for other business besides. One of them, broad through the shoulders, stepped into her path with the particular slow swagger of a man who'd been told to make a point and was enjoying the assignment. "Widow Marlow." He said it like a joke he'd rehearsed. "Heard you had some trouble out at your place." "Shame, did you?" "Flat?" Unmoved. Mr. Kane's concerned. Real concerned. His eyes went to the rifle on her saddle, lingered there. Man that concerned, he might come around again. Different night. Different men. "You understand me." Something cold settled into her chest, but her voice didn't shake. "I understand you plenty." "Good." He smiled, stepped closer, close enough that she caught the whiskey on his breath at 10 in the morning. "Smart woman, take that as a kindness. A warning, free of charge. Before what?" The voice came from behind him. Low, even, not raised at all, and somehow carrying further than a shout. The rider turned, found the stranger standing 10 feet off, thumbs hooked loose in his belt, looking at him with an expression that wasn't quite a challenge and wasn't quite anything else either, just a flat, patient attention that made the whole street go a little quieter around them. "This your business, friend?" the rider said, forcing bravado into it. "Making it my business." The stranger's eyes hadn't left him, hadn't blinked, that Josie could see. "Lady said she understood you. Don't reckon she needs the message twice." For a long moment, nobody moved. Josie's hand drifted, without her quite deciding it should, toward the rifle on her saddle. Because this was the moment. She could feel it settling over the street the way weather settles over a valley before a storm breaks, everyone sensing it. Nobody yet certain which way it would go. Then the second rider, the quieter one, put a hand on his partner's shoulder. "Not worth it," he muttered. "Not here. Not with witnesses." The broad-shouldered one held the stranger's eyes a moment longer, weighing something, before he finally spat into the dirt and turned away, mounting up with the particular stiff dignity of a man pretending he'd chosen to leave rather than been made to. "This ain't finished, widow," he called back. "Already retreating. Tell your new friend that too." The 2 of them rode out at a hard trot, and the street exhaled all at once, conversations resuming, the ordinary noise of the town rushing back in to fill the space the silence had left. Josie turned to the stranger, who was already looking away from the departing riders, unbothered, as though the whole exchange had cost him nothing at all. "I didn't ask for help," she said. "No," he agreed. "You didn't." A pause. "Wasn't offering it for your sake alone? Then whose?" He studied her a moment, something moving behind his eyes that looked, for just a flicker, like grief carefully kept at arm's length. "Your father's," he said. "Name's Gideon Cross. I knew Ezra Marlow a long time back, before you were old enough to remember much of anything." He touched his hat brim, formal, old-fashioned. "I'd take it as a kindness if you'd let me buy you a coffee, Mrs. Marlow. Got some things to tell you. Don't think you're going to care for most of them." They sat at the back table of the small cafe attached to the boarding house, away from the window, away from ears that had no business in this conversation, and Gideon Cross told her, in the same low, unhurried voice he'd used on Kane's man in the street, a story she hadn't expected and wasn't certain, at first she believed. He'd ridden with her father, he said, back before either of them settled Texas. Mostly, in the years right after the war, chasing rustlers and worse across country that hadn't yet decided whether it belonged to law or to whoever held it by force. Ezra Marlow had saved his life once, he said. Plain, no embellishment. The way a man states a debt he's carried a long time and never found occasion to properly repay. Your father wrote me, Gideon said. Years back. Before you were married even. Said he was worried about a man building up too much land too fast in this valley. Asked if I still had contacts who cared about that sort of thing. Did you answer him? I did. Didn't act on it fast enough. Something tightened around his eyes. By the time I got free to look into it proper, your father had passed. Peaceful, I heard. Didn't seem there was cause left to chase it. And now, he was quiet a moment, turning his coffee cup slow between his hands. Now I've spent the better part of 2 years working for the Territorial Land Office, he said. Quiet work. Not the kind that gets talked about. Looking into claims that got bought up too easy, too fast, by men who didn't always come by them honest. Silas Kane's name has come across my desk more than once. Josie's pulse picked up, though she kept her face still. Say what you mean, Mr. Cross. I mean, I've got reason to believe Kane's built half his empire on land he pressured, cheated, or otherwise took off folks who couldn't fight back proper. He met her eyes, steady. And I mean, I heard, 3 weeks back, secondhand, through channels I trust, that a rancher named Nathaniel Marlow died sudden 2 years ago. On land Kane's been wanting bad enough to send men in the dark for. That got my attention. Enough to ride out here myself and see what I could learn. The cafe noise seemed to fade around her, the clink of cups, the low murmur of other conversations, until it was just his voice, and the cold, careful certainty rising in her chest. You think Kane killed my husband? I think it's worth finding out for certain. He said it gentle, but there was no softness in the words themselves, only in the delivery, which is a different thing than knowing. I won't lie to you and call it knowing. Not yet. I've got a second set of hoofprints on a ravine road that never made sense to anyone but me, Josie said, quiet, the words coming out before she'd quite decided to trust him with them. 2 years, and I've told no living soul that. Gideon didn't look surprised. He looked, if anything, like a man whose worst suspicion had just been quietly confirmed. Then I expect, he said, we've got some work ahead of us. That same evening, before Gideon rode back to his room in town, Josie brought out the small wooden box where she kept what little remained of her father's private papers, deeds, receipts, a handful of letters she'd never once had reason or heart to read through carefully in the 10 years since his death. She'd always told herself there'd be time enough for that. Later, some quieter season when grief wasn't already stacked 3 deep in her chest. Later had never come. Now with Gideon Cross, sitting across her kitchen table, telling her Ezra Marlow had once written east, asking after a man who might look into land fraud, later felt like a debt finally come due. They went through the box together by lamplight, careful with pages gone brittle and yellow at the edges. Most of it was ordinary tax receipts, a letter from a cousin back in Missouri long since passed, a faded bill of sale for the second parcel that had brought the Deep Creek water into Marlow hands. But near the bottom, folded small and tucked inside a Bible, her mother had carried west and never once opened again. After the fever took her, Josie found a letter in her father's own hand, unsent, dated less than a year before his death. She read it twice before she trusted her voice enough to read it aloud. I have watched SK buy up 3 parcels this year. Alone, she read, slow, her father's careful plain script rising up off the page, in a voice she hadn't heard in 10 years. Each one from a family that left sudden and quiet, and each time the story told in town explained it away, tidy enough that no one thought to ask twice. I do not like the shape of it. I have written Gideon Cross, who I trust, to ask whether such things are watched by anyone with the standing to do something about them. I do not know if this letter will ever need finishing. I hope it will not. But I have learned in this country that hoping a thing away has never once made it smaller. The letter ended there, unfinished, exactly as Gideon had described it, her father's suspicion committed to paper, and then, for reasons she'd never know now, never sent, never spoken of, carried quiet in a Bible until a heart gave out one ordinary night 8 years back and took the rest of the sentence with it. He knew, Josie said quiet, setting the letter down with hands that had gone very careful, very deliberate. The way hands moved around something they understood, all at once, to be more fragile than it looked. Years before any of this touched me directly. He saw the shape of it starting, and he tried to do something, and then she couldn't finish it either, the same way her father's letter hadn't finished itself. Ran out of time, Gideon said, gentle. Same as most of us do, one way or another, before we've said everything we meant to. He looked at the letter a long moment, something moving behind his own eyes that Josie recognized now as old grief. He'd carried a long way to get here. I never got his letter in time to act on it, Mrs. Marlow. I've thought on that more than I care to admit these 2 years, since I finally started looking into Kane's business proper, wondering how much might have gone different, how many of those 11 families might still be sitting their own land tonight, if I'd moved faster. You can't carry that, Josie said, surprising herself with how plainly the words came, how much she meant them. I've spent 2 years, learning exactly how little good it does, carrying a thing that's already happened and can't be unhappened. You're here now. That's what matters. This side of it. Gideon held her eyes a moment, something easing in his face that she hadn't fully realized had been tight there since the day he'd ridden into town. Your father would have liked you saying that, he said. He was never one for wasted grief either, only the kind that pointed somewhere useful. She folded the letter careful, tucked it back inside the Bible where it had waited 10 patient years to be found, and understood, sitting there in lamplight, with a dead man's unfinished sentence between them, that whatever came next in this fight, she was no longer only fighting it for herself, or even only for Nathaniel. She was finishing something her father had started and never gotten the chance to close. The tally book she'd taken off the raiders became, in the days that followed, the first thread of something larger. Gideon studied it careful, cross-referencing names against records he carried folded in a battered leather case. Records, he explained, of land claims filed and abandoned across 3 counties over the past 6 years, an unsettling number of them bought up quick and quiet by the Kane Cattle Company, within months of the original claimant's sudden departure, or death, or unexplained decision to sell far below what the water rights alone should have fetched. 11, Gideon said, laying the papers across Josie's kitchen table one evening. Otis Pruitt, seated across from them, having ridden out at Josie's invitation once she'd decided the blacksmith had earned the right to know what she now knew. 11 claims in 6 years, all bordering good water. All changed hands within a year of some manner of trouble finding the original owner. Otis let out a low breath, shaking his head slow. Lord above. 11 families, Josie said, and something in her voice had gone very quiet, very still, the same stillness her father had once taught her to find before a shot. 11, and mine would have made 12, if those men had finished what they came to do. Would have made 12 either way, sooner or later, Gideon said, not unkindly, just honest. Which is why I don't think you ought to face what comes next alone. Whatever your rifle's capable of, Mrs. Marlow and I've a notion, hearing how those 3 men left your yard, that it's considerable. Kane's not a man who stops at one failed attempt. Men like him only get more careful, not more cautious about doing it. Otis flexed the fingers of his remaining hand against the table, an old habit Josie had noticed when the blacksmith was working something over in his mind that troubled him. I'm no gunman, he said. Lost my taste for that particular trade a long time back, along with the arm that used to hold a rifle steady. But I can shoe a horse quiet in the dark, mend a wagon axle faster than any man in 3 counties, and I know this valley's back trails better than Kane's hired guns ever will. He looked between them, resolute. You'll have what help I can give, Josie. Your father stood by me when half this town wouldn't shake a one-armed man's hand, for fear it'd remind them of the war. I don't forget a debt like that. Josie felt something loosen in her chest, some tight, lonely knot she hadn't fully realized she'd been carrying for 2 years, the particular ache of facing everything alone, finally, however slightly, shared. There's a boy, too, she said. Abel Boone. He's already offered. I told him to keep his eyes open around town. Nothing more, but he won't stay satisfied with that for long. Keep him at watching, Gideon said, firm. A boy that age, eager as you're describing, he's more used to us with sharp eyes and a fast horse to carry word than with a gun he hasn't the years yet to carry steady. Don't let his courage talk you into more than that. Not this early. Josie thought, though she didn't say it aloud, that Gideon Cross spoke like a man who had at some point in his life learned that particular lesson the hard way watched a boy's courage outrun his readiness, and paid some cost for it he still carried close. They rode to Sheriff Marsh's office together. 2 mornings later, Gideon's federal correspondence in hand letters bearing the Territorial Land Office seal, proof enough of his standing that even a man inclined to dismiss a widow's accusations might hesitate to dismiss a federal investigator's. Marsh did not hesitate long. He read the letters at his desk, jaw tight, color rising slow up his neck, and when he finally looked up, whatever careful, evasive warmth he'd always managed for Josie before was entirely gone, replaced by something harder, more guarded. 11 claim, Gideon said, laying out the pattern plain, unhurried, the same way he did everything. All bordering water Kane wanted. All processed through this office, Sheriff, with your signature on the incident. Reports each time trouble found the original owner. Man falls off a horse. Barn catches fire. Ruling accidental. Insurance never questioned. Family packs up sudden in the night. No forwarding address left behind. He let that sit a moment. That's a pattern a blind man could read. Sheriff Marsh, I'd be obliged if you'd help me understand how you missed it. 11 times running. Marsh's hands, Josie noticed, were not quite steady where they rested on the desk. I investigate what's brought to me, he said, voice tight. Same as any lawman would. Was this brought to you? Gideon tapped the tally book, which Josie had set on the desk between them. 3 armed men, a torch soaked in coal oil, and a widow left to defend her own home in the dark. That was brought to you 4 days back. What came of it? Silence stretched long and uncomfortable across the small office. I told her I'd look into it, Marsh said finally, weak. Did you? He stopped. Started again, and for just a moment his whole guarded manner cracked open and saw something that looked almost like the man Josie remembered from 12 years back, before whatever had happened to him had happened. You don't know what it is, being sheriff of a town this size, up against a man with Kane's money. Man like that, he doesn't threaten you outright. Doesn't need to. He just reminds you, real casual, what he could do to your family, your business, your standing in this county, if you made yourself inconvenient to him. Man like that doesn't need to raise his voice to be heard plain. So you looked away, Josie said quiet, and there was no anger left in it now, only a kind of tired, sorrowful clarity. 11 times, Judd. Maybe 12, counting me. Marsh didn't answer that. Couldn't, it seemed, find words equal to it. I'll need your full cooperation going forward, Gideon said, standing, gathering his letters back into their case. Or I'll need your badge, and a federal marshal riding in from Cheyenne within the week to take over this county's business entire. Your choice, Sheriff. But choose today. I've grown short on patience for men who need time to decide between right and easy. They left him sitting there, same as Josie had left him days before, though this time she thought she couldn't be entirely certain, but she thought something in his stillness carried the particular weight of a man finally, belatedly, ashamed. It was Otis who found the first real opening. 3 days later, in the particular way small towns always eventually yield their secrets to anyone patient enough to listen at the right forge, the right counter, the right saloon corner. A supply wagon he'd heard from a teamster passing through ran twice monthly between Kane's main ranch house and a way station, some 8 miles north, a supply depot, little more than a cabin, and a corral, where Kane kept extra men stationed during the busier cattle seasons, and where, the teamster mentioned, almost careless, papers and ledgers sometimes got kept when Kane didn't trust them close to his own house, in case a federal man ever came around asking too many questions. Man who runs it drinks too much and talks too free, Otis reported. Back at Josie's kitchen table that evening, the 3 of them gathered again over coffee gone cold from the length of the conversation. Wouldn't take much to get a look inside that cabin. Was a body careful about it? Gideon considered this a long moment, turning it over the way Josie had watched him turn over every piece of information that crossed his path since he'd ridden into town, slow, thorough, unwilling to move, until he'd examined every angle a thing might turn against him. Careful's the operative word, he said finally. We go in quiet. No shots fired unless there's no choice left in the matter. We're not there to punish anybody tonight. We're there to find paper proof solid enough to put in front of a federal judge something that ties Kane directly to what's been done, not just circumstantial pattern a clever lawyer could argue away. And if there's men there, Josie said, Then we're careful enough not to need to find out what your rifle does at close range. Something almost like a smile touched the corner of Gideon's mouth, there and gone. Though I've a feeling, watching you these past days, that you wouldn't mind the opportunity over much. I'd mind it fine, Josie said, though the words came out quieter than she meant them to, some old grief moving underneath them that had nothing to do with tactics and everything to do with 2 years spent trying not to become the kind of person circumstance seemed determined to make of her. I've buried enough. Don't relish adding to it, on either side of the ledger. Gideon's expression softened just slightly at that. Good, he said. Man who stops minding it, that's the man you ought to worry about. Your father minded it too every time, far as I ever saw. Didn't stop him doing what needed doing. Just meant he never once did it careless. They rode out 3 nights later, the moon down early, clouds thin enough to let starlight through, but nothing more good cover, Gideon judged, without being so dark a man risked, breaking his own neck on unfamiliar ground. The way station sat in a shallow draw, 1 cabin, a corral holding perhaps a dozen horses, a lamp burning low in the single window. Otis stayed back with the horses, a full quarter-mile off, ready to bring them up fast if trouble broke loose. Josie and Gideon went in on foot, low. The Sharps left behind this once in favor of her father's old revolver, a compact Remington that rode easier for close, quiet work than a rifle built for distance. They reached the cabin's blind side without incident. Gideon eased the shutter of the single side window, opened a careful inch, peered through, held up 2 fingers. 2 men inside. 1 asleep, from the sound of it. 1 awake, seated at a rough table, bottle close at hand, a ledger open before him that he wasn't reading so much as staring at, the particular unfocused stare of a man 3. Drinks passed, caring much about anything. Gideon worked the window the rest of the way open, slow, silent, years of practice, evident in the care of it, slipped inside. Josie followed, revolver ready, pulse loud in her own ears, but her hands, she noted with some distant satisfaction, entirely steady. The awake man didn't hear them until Gideon's hand closed over his mouth from behind, the other pressing the cold steel of a gun barrel, gentle but unmistakable, against his ribs. Not a sound, Gideon breathed, barely audible. You understand me. We'll all walk away from this easy. You don't? He let the sentence finish itself. The man went rigid, then nodded fast, sweat already beating at his temple. It took less than 10 minutes. The ledger on the table alone was worth the ride dates, payments, names crossed with the same Kane brand mark, and besides several of the 11 claims, Gideon had already flagged, notations in a cramped, careless hand that needed no great skill to interpret. Paid. 1 entry read, beside a name and a date 2 years back. Same entry, same month as the death of a rancher named Whitmore, whose claim, Gideon murmured low, bordering Josie's own land to the east, had passed to Kane within 4 months of the man's sudden, unexplained departure from the territory. Josie's eyes caught on a 3rd entry before Gideon could turn the page. A date. A name. N. Marlow. Her breath caught. She didn't say anything, couldn't. In that moment, trust her own voice, not to carry too far in the quiet cabin. But her hand, moving on its own, closed tight around the ledger's edge, because there it was. After 2 years of buried questions and careful silence, there it was. In a stranger's careless handwriting, cold and undeniable as the frost that had covered the grass the morning she'd found her husband's death called an accident. Proof. Gideon's hand closed over hers, gentle, urgent. Later his eyes said, plain as words, not here, not now. She nodded, jaw tight, and let him fold the ledger into his coat. They were nearly to the window again, the bound and gagged man secured quiet in the corner, when the second man, the one they'd believed asleep, stirred, groaned, and opened his eyes directly onto the scene unfolding in his cabin. He shouted. Everything after that happened fast, the way violence always seemed to happen fast, no matter how carefully a person had planned against it. The shout brought 2 more men pounding up from the corral, roused by the noise, guns already drawn. Gideon fired first, a shot that took the nearest man in the leg rather than anywhere worse a mercy. Josie understood distantly, even through her own racing pulse. That cost Gideon a precious half-second he didn't fully have to spare. A bullet caught him high in the shoulder as they broke for the window, spinning him half around with a grunt of pain he bit down hard against. Josie didn't think. Her body moved the way it had moved in her own yard, 4 nights back, the same cold, clear stillness, dropping over her like a second skin. She fired twice, covering their retreat, driving the remaining men back behind the corral fence long enough for her and Gideon to reach the tree line, Otis already thundering up with the horses at the sound of gunfire, exactly as promised. They rode hard for nearly 2 miles before Gideon finally allowed himself to slow, one hand pressed tight against his bleeding shoulder, face gone pale but grimly, stubbornly upright in the saddle. Ledger, he managed, through gritted teeth, when Josie reined up alongside him, alarm plain on her face. Got it. Worth the wound. You're bleeding through your coat, Mr. Cross. Noticed that myself. A pained, crooked attempt at a smile. Otis, that mending you do quiet in the dark, any of it extend to bullet wounds? More than I'd like it to at this point in my life, Otis said grimly, already reaching to steady him in the saddle. Get him back to the ranch, Josie. I'll see to it there. They tended Gideon's wound at Josie's kitchen table by lamplight, Otis working with the same steady, practiced competence he brought to every task, and Gideon bore it with the tight-jawed silence of a man who had clearly been shot before and knew better than to waste breath complaining about what couldn't be undone. It was well past midnight before the wound was cleaned and bound. Gideon settled, gray-faced but stable, in the second room Nathaniel had built with his own hands, for a family that never came. Josie sat across the table from where the ledger lay open, the entry that bore her husband's name catching lamplight in a way that seemed, to her exhausted mind, almost cruel in its plainness. N. Marlow. Paid. A date 2 years gone. She didn't cry. She'd told herself, 2 years back, that she was done with crying where it changed nothing, and she held to that now, staring at the proof she'd spent 2 years silently hunting, feeling something far colder and more purposeful settle into the space where grief might once have lived. Because this was no longer suspicion. This was no longer a question she carried alone in the dark, unspoken, unproven. This was Silas Kane's own hand, however careless, admitting what he'd done. She thought of her father's voice, patient across the years. It's a tool. Depends entirely on the hand. She thought, too, of what he'd said about the bones scattered across that plain, about men who took and took until there was nothing left but what they'd carelessly discarded along the way. There was a particular kind of grief, she was learning, that came after proof arrived too late to change anything it might have changed, had it come sooner. She had spent 2 years telling herself that certainty, if it ever came, would bring some measure of peace along with it, that knowing at last would settle the restless, unanswered ache that had lived in her chest since the sheriff first rode out with his hat in his hands. It didn't. If anything, the ledger's cold, careless handwriting had opened something wider than the not knowing ever had, because now there was no ambiguity left to soften the shape of what had been done to her, nor to the man who'd knelt on the edge of their bed each morning to pull his boots on, quiet so as not to wake her. She sat with that a long while, the lamp burning low, Gideon's breathing settling slow, and even in the next room, as whatever Otis had given him for the pain finally took hold. She thought of Nathaniel's hand lingering against her cheek the last morning she'd seen him alive, and she let herself, for just those few private minutes before dawn, grieve it properly, not the quiet, careful grief she'd rationed out to herself in small doses for 2 years, but the whole of it, unguarded, in a kitchen lit only by lamplight and the first gray suggestion of morning at the window. Silas Kane had taken her father's friend from him, in some fashion she didn't yet fully understand, had taken her husband, had tried 4 nights back to take everything else she had left. He was not going to take anything more. She banked the fire, blew out the lamp, and did not sleep again before dawn. Morning brought its own reckoning. Abel Boone came pounding up the road on his gelding just past dawn, breathless, hatless, having ridden hard enough to lather the poor animal badly. Mrs. Marlow. His voice cracked with something far past his usual eager energy, real fear, raw and unguarded. It's Otis. They took Otis. He fought to steady his own breathing, hands shaking on the reins. I was watching, like you said, keeping eyes open. Saw 2 of Kane's men asking around town late last night, asking after you, after the stranger who'd ridden in. I went to warn him at the smithy, only I got there too late. Too late how, Abel? Josie's voice had gone very quiet, very still, the way it always did now in the half-second before something broke open. Shop was tore up. Forge still hot, but nobody tending it. And his face had gone white. There was blood on the anvil, Josie. Not much, but enough. He fumbled a scrap of paper from his coat, hand shaking too hard to hold it steady. This was nailed to the door. Read it. Says you've got 3 days. His voice broke entirely on the words. 3 days to sign the land over to Kane. Quiet. No more trouble. No federal men. None of it. Or he couldn't finish it. Didn't need to. Josie saw the rest of the message written plain across the boy's terrified face, understood in one cold, sickening drop of her stomach, exactly what leverage Kane had decided, in the end, would prove more persuasive than fire or bullets or threats delivered warm and false across a fence line. Josie was already moving toward the door, toward her horse, toward the rifle that had never once, in 2 years, failed to answer when she needed it most. Within a minute, she was in the saddle, sharps across her lap, the cold morning wind cutting sharp against a face that had, in the space of 3 sentences, lost every trace of softness it had carried, even through the hardest days of the past 2 years. Because Otis Pruitt, one-armed blacksmith, her father's old friend, the first man in this whole ordeal to offer his help without hesitation or condition, was gone. Taken in the night, silent, while she'd slept unknowing in a house he'd helped defend only hours before. And somewhere out past the ridgeline, Silas Kane was waiting, patient as ever, for a widow he had badly, dangerously underestimated to finally, fully understand the true cost of refusing him. She was no longer willing to wait to find out what that cost might be. Otis Pruitt had been gone 11 hours before Josie stopped shaking long enough to think straight. She sat at her own kitchen table, the same table where the ledger still lay open. N. Marlow inked cold and careless beside a date she would carry the rest of her life, and she made herself breathe the way her father had taught her. Halfway. Hold it. Because panic wasn't going to bring Otis home. Panic never brought anybody home. Only cold, clear thinking did that, and she had precious little time left to indulge in anything else. Gideon sat across from her, gray-faced still from his wound but upright, his federal papers spread beside the ledger. His mind already working the problem the way hers was, not as a tragedy to grieve, not yet, but as a puzzle to be solved before grief became the only thing left to do about it. Kane won't kill him outright, Gideon said. Not yet. A dead blacksmith buys him nothing. A living one held quiet somewhere on his property, that's leverage. That's a message. He wants you scared enough to sign, not grieving enough to fight harder. You don't know that. I don't. He met her eyes honest, because she'd learned by now that Gideon Cross didn't traffic in false comfort, not even when comfort might have been kinder. But it's the reed that fits the pattern. Kane's built his whole empire on patience, not slaughter. Slaughter draws federal attention faster than land fraud ever did. He'll want this quiet, and quiet means Otis alive. For now, someplace close enough to watch, but far enough nobody stumbles onto him by accident. Abel, who hadn't left the kitchen since he'd delivered the news, spoke up from the corner, voice still raw. The old line shack. North pasture of Kane's spread, near the ridge. Otis took me hunting up that way once. Years back showed me the shack. Said Kane's men used it sometimes for calving season. Otherwise sat empty most of the year. He swallowed hard. It's out of the way. Quiet, be my guess, if I had to guess. Gideon looked at the boy a long moment, something like respect moving across his tired face. That's good thinking, son. I ain't a son to be praised, Mr. Cross. I want to come. You will come, Josie said, before Gideon could answer, surprising them both. Not into the shack. You'll hold the horses. Same as Otis did for us. But you've earned the right to be there when we bring him home. Abel's jaw tightened, fierce with something that looked, for just a moment, older than 16 years, had any business looking. Yes, ma'am. Before they rode out, Josie walked alone to the small fenced plot behind the cabin, where Nathaniel lay buried beside her father, the ground still hard with the last of winter's frost, though the first green shoots of spring grass had begun, stubborn, to push through near the headstones. She hadn't visited often these past 2 years. It had always seemed somehow too final a thing to do too regularly, as though standing here too often might wear a groove into her grief that she'd never manage to climb back out of. Tonight, though, with the shape of the coming reckoning settling heavy in her chest, she found she needed the visit more than she'd needed almost anything else in longer than she could remember. I know now, she said quietly. to the plain wooden marker Otis had carved 2 years back, simple and unadorned the way Nathaniel himself had always been. Took me long enough. I'm sorry it took so long. The wind moved soft through the grass, carrying nothing but the ordinary sounds of an ordinary evening, and Josie let herself stand there a long while, unhurried, saying nothing more, because some conversations didn't need more words than that to carry their whole weight. She thought of the man he'd been quiet, honest, proud of a wife the rest of the county thought needed protecting rather than admiring. She thought of the child's room he'd built with his own hands, hope evident in every careful joint and corner, hope that had never gotten the chance to be fulfilled. I'm going to finish it, she told him, finally rising, brushing frost from her knees. Whatever it costs. You deserve that much, and more besides. She touched 2 fingers to the headstone, the way she had every visit since the burial, and walked back to where Gideon and Abel waited with the horses. Her resolve settled now into something that felt, for the first time in 2 years, less like grief carried alone and more like purpose shared. They rode out that night, the same careful dark Gideon favored for work that couldn't stand daylight. Moon thin, clouds cooperating, the whole valley holding itself still the way it always seemed to. Before Josie asked something hard of it, Gideon's shoulder wasn't healed. Wouldn't be for weeks yet. Otis had warned him. The last thing the blacksmith had said to either of them before he'd ridden off to warn Abel and vanished into whatever dark had swallowed him. But Gideon rode anyway, jaw set, revolver in his good hand, because some debts, Josie was coming to understand, didn't wait on convenient healing. The line shack sat exactly where Abel had guessed, a low, sod-roofed structure tucked into a fold of the ridge, one window glowing faint with lamplight, 2 horses tied outside. Josie's heart hammered against her ribs. The whole slow crawl through the grass, the same wild drumbeat she remembered from the night of the raid, though this time the fear carried a different weight to it entirely. That night, she had fought to protect what was hers. Tonight, she fought to reclaim something that had been taken from her, and somewhere underneath she recognized was a fury she hadn't let herself feel fully until this exact moment, kneeling in cold grass with a friend's freedom hanging on how steady her hands proved to be. 2 men only. Josie counted them from the tree line, the same careful counting her father had taught her before a hunt, and felt something in her chest ease very slightly at the number. 2 she could manage. 2, with Gideon beside her even wounded, and the particular fiercy steadying her hands that came from knowing exactly whose life hung on getting this right. They left Abel with the horses, same promise as before, same fierce nod in return, and moved in low through grass, gone silver-black under the thin moon. Voices carried faint from inside the shack, one man laughing at something, the other lower, telling him to shut it. They were meant to be quiet. Josie eased to the window, looked in. Otis sat bound to a chair in the corner, head down, one eye swollen nearly shut, but breathing, alive. Her chest loosened another fraction at the sight of it, though the swollen eye lit something else entirely, something colder, harder, that had nothing to do with relief. She looked at Gideon. He nodded once. They went in together, fast, no more caution left to spend, once the moment for it had passed. Gideon took the nearer man before he'd fully turned from his chair, a hard blow with the revolver's grip that dropped him boneless to the dirt floor. The second reached for his own gun, got halfway, found Josie's Remington already leveled at his chest from 4 feet away, close enough that even a nervous hand couldn't miss. "Don't," she said. Just that. One word, flat and final, and something in her voice must have carried every ounce of the 2 days behind it, because the man's hands went up slow, empty, without further argument. They had Otis free of his bindings inside a minute, the blacksmith stiff and pale but alert, managing a crooked, painful attempt at a smile the moment his hands were loose. "Took your time," he rasped. "You're worth the wait, Otis." Josie's voice broke, just slightly, on the words, the first crack she'd allowed herself in 2 full days of holding steady. Can you ride? Watch me." They bound the 2 captured men where Otis had sat, left them for whoever eventually came looking, and rode hard back toward town under a sky just beginning, at its eastern edge, to soften toward gray. It was Otis, cleaned up and fed, and finally allowed to rest at Josie's kitchen table the next afternoon, who gave them the peace that finally made the whole shape of Silas Kane's obsession make sense. They talked some, while I was tied up there," he said, voice still rough, one hand wrapped careful around a cup of coffee Josie had pressed on him against his protests that he didn't need coddling. Men get careless, thinking a bound man's no threat to overhear. Talked about Kane. About how this whole business with your land was never only about water, Josie. Not at the root of it. What then? Gideon asked, leaning forward despite the ache still evident in his shoulder. Otis was quiet a moment, choosing his words with the particular care of a man about to hand someone a grief they hadn't asked for. "Your father," he said finally, "killed a man some 20 years back. Before you were old enough to remember it plain, Josie, horse thief, caught red-handed running off with stock that wasn't his. Your father was well within his rights. Every law this territory ever wrote backs a man defending his stock against a thief caught in the act. Wasn't even much talked about at the time. Happened, and the valley moved on, the way it always did." "What's that got to do with Kane?" Josie said, though something cold was already tightening in her chest, some instinct arriving ahead of the answer. "The thief's name was Caleb Kane," Otis said. "Silas's younger brother." The kitchen went very still. Josie sat with that a long moment, turning it over the way she'd turn over any hard truth, looking for what moved underneath it. 20 years. A brother she'd never once heard mentioned. Not by her father, not by anyone in this valley. Buried so deep in the past, it had never once surfaced in all her years growing up on this land. "He never said a word of it," she said quietly. "Not once. Not in all the years he taught me to shoot, to hunt, to hold this land. Maybe he didn't think it worth burdening you with," Gideon said, gentle. "Or maybe he'd made his peace with it long before you were old enough to ask. A man defends his stock. A thief dies for the choice he made. Your father likely carried that as simple fact, not guilt. Wasn't his to carry different, but Kane carried it different," Josie said, understanding arriving cold and complete. "Carried it 20 years, and never once let it go. All this, the land, the water, the pressure, the fire he sent to burn me out, none of it was ever truly about the creek at all. The creek gave him reason enough to act without drawing suspicion," Gideon said. "A cattle baron wanting good water off a widow's land. Nobody questions that motive twice, but underneath it, near as I can now piece together, Silas Kane spent 20 years waiting for exactly this chance. A dead rival's daughter, alone, holding land he could take with a business excuse. Plain enough that nobody in this valley would ever think to ask what truly drove him to it." Josie thought of Kane's face the first morning he'd ridden onto her land, the flicker she'd caught, and nearly dismissed when he spoke her father's name. Now there was a man who understood how this country worked. She understood now what had truly moved behind that careful, practiced warmth. Not greed alone. 20 years of grief curdled slow and patient into something far colder, far more dangerous than simple want had ever been. She wondered, briefly, what kind of man Silas Kane might have become if he had let that grief pass through him honestly, the way she was only now learning to let her own grief pass, rather than building an empire out of its slow, careful curdling. It was, she thought, its own kind of tragedy, one more casualty of a single bad night 20 years gone, spreading its damage forward through a whole valley's worth of lives that had never once touched the original wound. They moved against Kane. 2 days later, Gideon's wound healed enough by then to trust his aim. The federal papers he carried finally sufficient, alongside the ledger and the tally book, to justify the risk of moving before every last piece was in place. The plan was simple, as Gideon liked his plans to be. Ride to the Kane ranch house in daylight, in plain sight, with federal authority behind them, and Sheriff Marsh cornered by then into cooperation or exposure, whichever preferred riding alongside as the county's own lawful witness. Present the evidence. Force Kane's hand in front of enough witnesses that no quiet arrangement could bury it afterward. It went wrong within the first 5 minutes. Kane was waiting on his porch when they rode in, unsurprised, unbothered, as though he'd known this reckoning was coming, and had simply chosen, in his patience, to let it arrive on his own ground, rather than chase it elsewhere. "Mrs. Marlow." His smile hadn't changed, not 1 degree, from the first morning he'd ridden onto her land. "And federal company. My, you have been busy." "It's over, Kane," Gideon said, dismounting slow, careful of his shoulder, the ledger and tally book in hand. 11 claims. 2 years of documented fraud. A murdered rancher whose death you paid to have arranged. I've got enough here to see you tried in Cheyenne, and enough witnesses today to make certain nothing quiet happens to make this evidence disappear before it gets there. Something in Kane's expression shifted, not fear, not yet, but a kind of cold recalculation. The look of a patient man discovering his patience had finally run out ahead of him rather than behind. Murdered, he repeated, almost thoughtful. Strong word for an accident on a ravine road. Was it an accident? Josie said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Say it plain, Kane. After everything. I think I've earned that much from you. For a long moment, nobody spoke. The wind moved through the yard, carrying the smell of cattle and dust, and, faint underneath it, something that might have been fear finally beginning to work its way into a man who had, for 20 years, believed himself entirely beyond its reach. Kane's men on the porch had gone very still. Josie noticed, none of them quite meeting their employer's eyes anymore. Whatever loyalty Kane's money had bought over the years, it seemed to be draining fast out of the yard along with the last of his composure. Say it, Josie pressed, when the silence stretched too long to bear. You've built 20 years of careful silence around whatever this is. I've buried 2 years of my own life not knowing why. I think, whatever comes next for you, you owe this valley the truth before the law takes the rest. Your father killed my brother, Kane said finally, low, and something raw broke through the practiced warmth for the first time since Josie had known him. Caleb was 17 years old. 17. Foolish, yes. Reckless, yes. But your father put a bullet through him over a horse, Mrs. Marlow, and this whole valley called it justice and moved on like a boy's whole life was worth no more than the animal he'd taken. He was stealing, Josie said, though something in her chest ached even as she said it, some old grief of her father's she'd never known she carried until this very moment. My father had the law behind him. The law. Kane's laugh held no humor in it at all. The law that let a man shoot a boy dead and never once ask whether there might have been a gentler way to stop him. The same law that's protected you your whole life, the way it never once protected my family. He looked at her, and for just a moment, Josie saw past the smile entirely, saw the 20-year-old grief still raw underneath it, undiminished by time, curdled instead into something that had consumed everything decent it might once have held. I didn't send men to kill your husband out of greed, Mrs. Marlow. I sent them because your family took mine, and the debt was never paid. And Nathaniel, Josie said, her voice breaking now despite every effort to hold it steady. He had nothing to do with any of that. He never harmed you nor yours. No, Kane agreed. Quiet. He didn't. But he stood between me and finishing what your father started. That was enough. The confession hung in the yard between them, plain and undeniable. And what rose in Josie was neither relief nor triumph, but something far heavier, the particular grief of watching a man's entire life curdle down to nothing but the shape of an old wound he'd never once let heal. Who? She made herself ask. Who did it? Whose hand? Kane's eyes slid, just slightly, toward the road behind them, toward Sheriff Judd Marsh, who had gone very still in his saddle, face gone the color of old ash. Judd. Josie's voice came out barely above a whisper, disbelief and dawning horror tangling together in it. Tell me he's lying. Marsh didn't answer. Couldn't, it seemed, find his voice at all, staring at Kane with an expression of pure, cornered betrayal. You son of a... Whatever Marsh meant to say died half-formed in his throat. He needed money, Kane said, almost gentle now, almost cruel in how gentle it was, twisting the knife of Marsh's exposure with the same patient precision he'd brought to everything else. Gambling debts, wasn't it, Sheriff? Bad enough the bank was set to call in your note on that house of yours. I offered a solution. He rode out that morning, met your husband on the ravine road under some pretext about the survey business, and made certain his horse startled at the worst possible bend. He shrugged. Small, indifferent, simple. Really, accidents happen easy enough on a trail like that, if a man knows exactly where to make one happen. Judd. Josie's whole body had gone cold, colder than the night of the raid, colder than anything she'd felt in 2 years of grief. You told me. You sat your horse in my yard and told me to be careful. You let me grieve him for 2 years, not knowing. I didn't have a choice, Marsh said, and his voice cracked entirely on it. Whatever composure he'd maintained for 2 years, finally catastrophically failing him. Kane owned my note. Would have ruined me. Ruined my family if I hadn't. You had a choice. Gideon's voice cut through it, hard, flat, entirely without mercy. Every man has a choice, Sheriff. You made yours the day you rode out to that ravine, and you made it again every day since. Every time this woman came to you for help, and you sent her away with warnings instead of justice. Marsh's hand moved, sudden, toward his revolver, some final, desperate calculation flickering across his face, that if the witnesses could be silenced, if this moment could somehow still be undone. Josie's hand moved faster. The sharps, drawn from her saddle scabbard in one smooth motion that carried 17 years of practice behind it, was leveled at Marsh's chest before his own weapon had cleared its holster. "Don't," she said. Same words she'd used in the line shack. Same flat, final certainty behind it. Marsh froze, hands still on his half-drawn revolver, staring down the barrel of a rifle built 3 generations back, for exactly this, for the moment when everything came down to whether a steady hand could hold the line between chaos and control. The whole yard held its breath. This was the moment, Josie understood distantly, that her father's old lesson had been preparing her for the whole of her life, without either of them ever knowing it. A tool is only ever as dangerous as the hand that holds it. She could kill him, right here, right now. Nobody in this yard, not Gideon, not Kane's own men, watching frozen from the porch, not even, she suspected, some cold and grieving corner of her own heart would have called it anything but justice, after everything he'd taken from her. Her finger rested light against the trigger. Her hands, for the first time in days, were perfectly, terribly steady. She thought of every night these past 2 years she'd lain awake, wondering what shape justice might take, if it ever came at all, had imagined, more than once, in her darkest hours, exactly this moment, a gun in her hand, and the man responsible finally within her power. She had never once, in those imagined moments, pictured herself hesitating. And yet here, with the moment finally actually arrived, she found that hesitation was not weakness at all, but something closer to the deepest strength her father had ever tried to teach her. And she thought, in that suspended half-second, of her father, kneeling behind her in tall grass, patient as stone, teaching her to hold her breath before a shot. Never let it decide who you are. You decide that. The rifle just listens. She thought of Nathaniel's hand against her cheek, gentle, that last morning. Of the man he'd been quiet, honest, never once flinching from what she was. He would not have wanted this, she understood, with a certainty that settled deep and unshakable into her chest. He would not have wanted her to become, in avenging him, the very thing that had taken him from her. "Sheriff Judd Marsh," she said, and her voice, to her own faint surprise, came out clear and steady, carrying across the whole silent yard. "You're under arrest for the murder of Nathaniel Marlow. Federal witness standing right beside me heard you confess it plain, along with every man on this porch." She lowered the rifle, just slightly, not all the way. Not yet. Not until she was certain the moment had truly passed, but enough to show every watching eye exactly what choice she had made. And why? "I won't be the thing you turned me into," she said, quieter now, meant only for him, though the whole yard heard it regardless. "I won't kill a man in cold blood, however much he's earned it. That's not justice, Judd. That's only more of the same grief this valley's already drowned in far too long." Gideon moved fast then, closing the distance, disarming Marsh's still half-drawn revolver, binding his hands with the particular economy of a man who had done this exact thing more times than he cared to count. "Silas Kane," Gideon said, turning, voice ringing hard and clear across the yard, federal authority behind every word of it now. "You're under arrest for conspiracy to murder, land fraud, and attempted arson, on evidence sufficient to see you tried in the territorial capital. Your men on that porch can stand down easy, or stand trial alongside you. Their choice." For a long moment, Kane's men wavered, hands hovering near their own weapons, calculating odds that had, in the space of 5 minutes, shifted entirely against them. Then, one by one, they lowered their hands. Kane himself did not move. Stood on his porch, watching the whole careful architecture of 20 years' patient revenge collapse in the space of a single afternoon, and his whole bearing, Josie thought, looked almost relieved, the particular relief of a man finally, after 2 decades, allowed to sit down a weight he'd carried so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand without it. "Your father was a good man," he said, quiet, as Gideon moved to bind his hands as well. "I want you to know I always believed that, even at the worst of it. A good man who made one hard choice on one bad night, and I let that choice eat 20 years of my life I might have spent building something worth having, instead of tearing down everything he left behind." He looked at Josie, something almost like an apology. 20 years too late to mean anything, moving behind his eyes. "I'm sorry for your husband, Mrs. Marlow. That much at least, I mean plainly." Josie held his gaze a long moment and found to her own quiet surprise that she believed the apology, even as she understood it changed nothing about what came next, about the trial awaiting him, about the 2 years of grief his patient cruelty had cost her. There was, she thought, a particular kind of tragedy in watching a man arrive at honesty only once every avenue toward using it well had already closed behind him. She wondered briefly whether her father had ever known how deeply that old, necessary choice had wounded a family beyond the one it had been meant to protect, and found she was glad, in the end, that he hadn't lived to carry that particular knowledge alongside everything else. "I believe you," she said. "It doesn't undo what you did, but I believe you." The ride back to Elk Creek that afternoon carried a different weight than any ride Josie had taken in 2 long years. Kane and Marsh bound and silent between Gideon and 2 of Kane's own former riders, who'd chosen, in the end, cooperation over loyalty to a man whose empire had just visibly, irreversibly crumbled. The whole town turned out to watch them come in, word having outrun even their horses. The street lined with faces Josie had spent 2 years enduring pity from, now watching something else entirely cross her face as she rode past. Not pity now. Something closer to respect, hard-won and unmistakable. Mrs. Abernathy stood near the dry goods store, the same spot she'd stood a year before when she'd murmured that a widow hunting alone wasn't decent, and Josie caught her eye for just a moment as she passed. The older woman's expression held none of its old sharpness, now only a kind of chastened wonder, and something that might, in a woman less proud, have counted as an apology. "Lord above," Josie heard her murmur to the woman beside her, not troubling to lower her voice this time either, though the words carried an entirely different weight than they once had. "That's the widow Marlow. Rode right into Kane's own yard and brought the sheriff back in chains." Wallace Hutchins stood outside his store, hat off, watching solemn. Otis, still healing, stood beside him, managing despite his bruises a small, fierce grin of pure pride. Abel Boone stood at the very front of the gathered crowd, unable to keep still, practically vibrating with the need to tell the story to anyone who'd listen. Already, Josie suspected, rehearsing exactly how he'd describe this day for years to come. Gideon delivered Kane and Marsh into the custody of a federal marshal summoned from Cheyenne. Within the week, the evidence ledger, tally book, sworn testimony sufficient to see both men stand trial for crimes that would, in the fullness of territorial law, cost Kane the whole of his empire, and see Marsh stripped of every shred of the authority he'd betrayed. The land, Josie's land, was hers again, in every sense that mattered, not merely on paper, where it had always technically remained hers, but in the deeper sense that mattered more, the sense of ground finally, fully secured against the shadow that had hung over it for 2 long years. She rode to Sheehan herself in early October, when the territorial court finally called her to testify, a journey of 3 days each way that she made alongside Gideon, and for the first stretch of it, Otis, who insisted on seeing her at least as far as the rail spur before turning back to mind the ranch in her absence. It was the farthest from Elk Creek Josie had traveled in her whole life, and she spent much of the ride watching country change around her plains, giving way to rougher ground. Then, to the raw, busy sprawl of the territorial capital itself. More people in one street than she'd seen gathered in her entire life until that morning. The courtroom was smaller than she'd expected, close and overheated, every bench filled with men come to watch a cattle baron answer for his empire. Josie sat in the witness chair with her hands folded plain in her lap, no rifle within reach for the first time in longer than she could remember, and told the court exactly what had happened, in the same flat, steady voice she'd used in Kane's own yard. The raid, the tally book, the ledger, the ravine road that had never once made proper sense to her. She did not embellish, did not need to. The facts, laid out plain, carried weight enough on their own. Kane's lawyer, a sharp Cheyenne man in an expensive coat, tried more than once to paint her as a grieving widow, whose grief had curdled into vengeful imagination, suggested gently that a woman alone might see conspiracy where there was only misfortune, might mistake coincidence for murder in her hunger, to have somebody, anybody, to blame for a husband's ordinary bad luck. Mrs. Marlow, he said, careful and courteous in the way. Men were courteous when they meant to unsettle you without ever raising their voice. Isn't it possible that grief alone led you to see a pattern that was never truly there? Josie held his eyes a long moment before she answered, and when she spoke, her voice carried clean across the whole silent courtroom. I buried my husband not knowing, she said. I lived 2 years not knowing, wondering, telling myself I was foolish for wondering at all. If grief alone could conjure a signed ledger with his name in Silas Kane's own hand, I'd count myself the most powerful woman in this territory, and I expect you'd have found some other way to explain that away, too. She let that sit a moment. I didn't come here on grief, sir. I came here on proof. There's a considerable difference, and I'd have thought a man in your profession would know it better than most. A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the gallery before the judge's gavel restored order, and the lawyer did not try that particular line of questioning again. Winter came hard that year, as Wyoming winters always did, but the Marlow ranch weathered it better than it had in longer than Josie cared to remember. Otis rode out often, once his strength returned fully, mending what needed mending, staying sometimes for supper, filling the quiet house with the particular easy company of an old friend who asked nothing of her except her continued good health. Abel came whenever the smithy could spare him, eager still, though something steadier had settled into him since the night he'd helped hold the horses outside a line shack and waited, terrified, for the people he loved to come back safe. Otis had taken to teaching him proper smithing over the darkest months, and Abel had taken to it with the same eager focus he'd once brought to begging. Looks at the sharps a trade, Otis said approvingly. That would serve him a good deal longer than gunplay ever would. In a valley finally growing quiet enough to let a young man build something instead of merely surviving it. Word came in late autumn that Silas Kane's trial in Cheyenne had concluded guilty on every count the territorial court had brought against him, his empire broken apart and its parcels returned, where the law could manage it, to the families or heirs of the men and women he'd wronged. It would take years, Gideon told her, reading the letter by lamplight one November evening, to fully untangle 11 claims worth of fraud. But the untangling had begun, and that alone, after so long, felt like a kind of justice Josie had stopped believing this territory capable of delivering. Judd Marsh's trial followed a month after, shorter, its outcome never much in doubt, once Gideon's testimony and Josie's own were entered into the record. He would hang in the spring, the letter said, plain and unadorned, and Josie found, reading the news, that she felt no triumph in it at all, only a kind of tired, sorrowful closure, the particular grief of watching a man who might once have been decent finish the long, slow work of destroying himself. Gideon Cross stayed through the winter as well, his federal business in the territory far from finished, the pattern of Kane's fraud stretching, it turned out, into corners of 3 counties that would take considerably longer than 1 season to fully untangle. He took a room in town, at first, though he found reason, as the months wore on, to ride out to the Marlow ranch with increasing frequency, reasons that had less and less. Josie noted with a private, careful sort of warmth she wasn't yet ready to examine too closely, to do with federal business at all. She wasn't ready, not yet, to call it anything more than friendship. Grief this deep didn't clear all at once, however much justice had settled the worst of its unanswered questions. But she found on the long winter evenings, when Gideon sat across her kitchen table, telling quiet stories of her father from years before she was born, stories of a younger Ezra Marlow, reckless and laughing, and utterly unlike the careful, patient man she'd known growing up, that something in her chest that had been clenched tight for 2 years had slowly, cautiously begun to loosen. He never once pressed her toward more than she offered. That, she came to understand over the long winter months, was its own kind of respect, rare enough in her experience of men that she'd nearly forgotten what it looked like. He simply stayed, useful and unhurried, mending what needed, mending alongside Otis, teaching Abel a thing or two about tracking that even Josie hadn't thought to cover, and waiting, patient as her father had ever been, for whatever came next to arrive in its own good time. Spring came at last, the way it always did in that country, sudden and green. After a long gray winter, the creek running full and clear past pastures that belonged, undisputed now, to the daughter of the man who'd first claimed them. Josie rode out before dawn one morning, in early May, the way she had 100 mornings before, the Sharp's rifle riding easy across her saddle, her breath fogging pale in the cool air. She found a rise overlooking the valley, dismounted, and lay flat in grass, gone green and soft with the season's new growth, watching the eastern sky lighten slow toward gold. A mule deer picked its way down toward the creek below, exactly as one had, nearly a year before, on the morning this whole long reckoning had begun. She raised the rifle, found her breath, held it, and in that half-second of stillness, the same stillness her father had taught her, kneeling behind her in tall grass so many years ago, the same stillness that had steadied her hands through fire and grief, and a reckoning 20 years in the making she understood, with a clarity that felt, at last, like peace, rather than merely survival, exactly what he had meant, all those years ago, about the difference between a tool and the hand that held it. The rifle had never once decided who she was. She had decided that herself, every single time it mattered, the night 3 men came to burn her out, and she chose to fight rather than flee. The morning in the sheriff's office when she chose to speak the truth plain rather than swallow it quiet, as she had for 2 long years before. The yards outside Kane's ranch house, rifle leveled at a murderer's chest, when she chose mercy over the vengeance that would have been so easy, so justified, and so utterly unlike the man she'd loved and buried. Every choice had been hers alone to make, the rifle only ever the instrument, never the will behind it. She would go on deciding it, this morning and every morning after, for as long as this valley remained hers to protect. She lowered the rifle without firing, let the deer drink its fill and wander on, unharmed, because there was meat enough in the smokehouse this particular morning, and because some mornings she was learning the stillness itself was worth more than anything a shot might have brought her. Behind her, faint on the morning wind, she heard a second horse approaching, unhurried, familiar now, in a way that had crept up on her slowly over the long winter months without her quite noticing when it happened. She didn't turn right away. Simply let herself feel the particular ease of no longer being entirely alone on this ridge, watching the sun climb, and found that the feeling, once so foreign it had frightened her, had become something closer to home than she'd expected it ever could again. "Fine morning for it," Gideon said, reining up beside her, his own rifle resting easy across his saddle. Now the shoulder wound, long since healed to nothing more than a faint ache on cold days. "It is," she agreed, and meant it, in a way she hadn't quite managed to mean much of anything for 2 long years before this one. They rode back down toward the valley together as the sun cleared the ridge behind them, toward a home that was, for the first time in 2 long years, entirely and peacefully her own, and toward whatever came next, which she found. For once, she was no longer afraid to meet.